Hi, I'm Tessa with Brain Rot News. Our entire household is very sick, so I brought a group of reruns for you to choke on.
Brain Rot the News.
Hi, I'm Tessa from Brain Rot News with a few bits of history for you to choke on so you can digest how we got to this point. Blood money and the invisible handjob. This is a place where free trade means multinational corporations are free to exploit, pillage, and offshore your job to Bangladesh, while tariffs are dusted off like grandpa's racist heirlooms whenever a politician needs to look tough on China or give Boeing a slappy kiss. If you thought economics was a quiet debate over supply and demand curves, think again. It's more like an endless knife fight in a locked room where the rich keep changing the rules and the poor keep bleeding. Tariffs, in this grotesque carnival, are the spiked bats of economic policy handed out to protect fragile egos, line donor pockets, or occasionally support American workers, or more accurately, support corporate stock buybacks. Today, we dive face first into the swirling cesspool that is U.S. tariff policy, a centuries-long carnival of grift, hypocrisy, backroom deals, and bipartisan economic violence. It's the story of rich men playing God with your prices while insisting it's all for your own good, Congress auctioning off tariff lines like beanie babies on eBay, and you, the voter, the consumer, the meat puppet, left footing the bill. Let's begin. Part 1. The Founding Frauds. Let's roll the clock all the way back to the 1600s when America wasn't even America yet, just a collection of soggy colonies clinging to the Atlantic seaboard like barnacles on the armpit of empire. Back then, Britain ran the show under the grand imperial logic of mercantilism, an economic system that can be boiled down to colonies exist to make the mother country richer, shut up and pay your damn taxes. Under mercantilism, Britain slapped tariffs, duties, and trade restrictions on everything. The colonies were supposed to export raw materials like tobacco, cotton, timber, and import finished goods from England. You want Dutch cloth or French wine? Tough luck, you're buying British. Why? Because London said so, and because tariffs made non-British goods more expensive than a dueling pistol made of diamonds. Fast forward to the mid-1700s, and American colonists are getting testy. They're growing wealthy, at least the white landowners are, but Britain keeps bleeding them dry. The Navigation Acts, Sugar Act, and Stamp Act were each a new way to say, pay us or else. And what was the else? Well, let's just say it involved redcoats and muskets. Tariffs and taxes became the economic fuel behind the ideological fire of revolution. No taxation without representation wasn't a TikTok slogan, it was the real deal, and it was about much more than stamps and sugar. It was about control, whether you got to decide your own economic fate or whether some powdered wig sociopath in London got to dictate it for you. Cue the American Revolution, a bloody tantrum that was, in large part, a trade war in red and blue uniforms. And when the colonies won and declared themselves a real country, they were left with a big shiny problem. How do you fund a new government without a king or empire backing you up? The answer? Tariffs, baby. The fledgling United States was broke, like rummaging through the couch cushions broke. The Articles of Confederation gave the federal government all the authority of a substitute teacher on their first day. States had their own currencies. There was no national army. British creditors were lurking in the financial shadows like repo men. Something had to give. So then came Alexander Hamilton, the original Wall Street hype man, and the founding father most likely to carry a copy of The Economist and a flintlock pistol. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton looked at America's patchwork economy and said, we need revenue, we need industry, and we need to stop acting like backwater pig farmers. So in 1791, Hamilton dropped his report on manufacturers like a mixtape from hell. He envisioned an America not just growing tobacco and selling furs, but actually building stuff, ironworks, textiles, and factories, an industrial nation. To get there, he proposed a high protective tariff, a paywall around the American economy. Foreign goods, jack up the price. Domestic production, subsidize the hell out of it. But Hamilton's vision didn't land in a vacuum. It landed in the middle of an existential brawl between northern industrial wannabes and southern plantation aristocrats who didn't want anything getting in the way of their slave-powered cotton cash machine. The South hated tariffs. But why? Because they didn't make stuff. They exported raw goods and brought back fancy imports. A tariff meant paying more for British finery and pissing off the very European markets that bought their cotton. So while Hamilton was scribbling economic fan fiction about American factories, southern elites were polishing their monocles and drafting angry letters about tyranny. The Tariff Act of 1789 passed anyway, becoming the first real national revenue stream. It was relatively modest, more about funding the government than shielding American industry, but it set a precedent. The federal government could now tax imports, and that power was going to grow. Over the next few decades, tariffs became the backbone of federal revenue. There was no income tax yet, no IRS knocking on your door. The government got its cash by making imported goods more expensive, which means the poor paid more just to live, while the rich kept lobbying for protection of of their precious industries. By the 1820s, the tariff debate had mutated into full-blown partisan warfare. The North wanted higher tariffs to protect its fragile industries. The South wanted low tariffs to protect their slave-powered export economy. Sound familiar? It's the blueprint for every economic fight America's ever had. Who pays, who profits, and who gets to write the rules. Then came 1828, and with it the infamous Tariff of Abominations. That's not just like some edgy nickname I made up, it's what they called it at the time. It jacked up tariffs to record levels, especially on raw materials like wood and iron, goods the South relied on but didn't produce. It was a direct hit to the Southern economy, and they knew it. So what did the North get? Protected industries, more jobs, the beginnings of the Rust Belt in utero. The South got higher prices, a sense of betrayal, and the creeping realization that the federal government was no longer operating in their favor. The stage was set for nullification, for sectional crisis, and for a civil war that had already been humming in the baseline. So before the Civil War, before Fort Sumter, before Lincoln's stovepipe hat entered the frame, tariffs were already driving a wedge through the heart of the Republic, not because of the policy itself, but because of what it represented: power, money, and who got to wield both. Part 2. Nullification Nation. So, the Tariff of Abominations passed in 1828. It was one of the greatest political middle fingers ever handed down from Washington. Officially, it was a protective tariff meant to guard budding northern industries from British imports. Unofficially, it was a grenade lobbed into the economic heart of the South. This wasn't a simple import tax, it was a message. The federal government was here to play favorites, and the North was holding the controller. The South, especially South Carolina, lost its damn mind. And who was leading the charge? John C. Calhoun, the patron saint of states' rights and aristocratic plantation cosplay, a man who could write a treatise on liberty while owning people like cattle. Calhoun decided that if the federal government passed a law a state didn't like, the state could just nullify it, erase it, ignore it, pretend it didn't exist. His weapon of choice? Constitutional wordplay and the sheer weight of his powdered wig ego. So in 1832, South Carolina declared the federal tariff null and void within state borders. That's not policy disagreement, that's a secessionist dress rehearsal. This wasn't just about wool and iron duties, it was the economic equivalent of drawing pistols at the family dinner. The nullification crisis wasn't about taxes, it was about who held the reins of national power. It was about whether a slave-holding aristocracy could veto democracy at any time it felt slightly inconvenienced. Then came Andrew Jackson, war hero, populist strongman, genocidal maniac. A man so allergic to being challenged that he wants to beat a would-be assassin with his cane. Jackson was no friend to abolitionists or Native Americans, but when it came to the Union, he was all in. He saw South Carolina's nullification tantrum as a direct threat to federal authority. So he responded with the Force Bill of 1833, which basically said, yeah, I can send the army to collect tariffs if you piss me off enough. South Carolina blinked. Calhoun retreated into his parlor to write another 40,000 words on how tyranny is when rich white men don't get their way. Congress, always eager to split the baby, passed a compromise tariff to lower the rates over time. Crisis averted, for now, but the real takeaway was clear. Tariffs were now a frontline issue in the war over federal versus state power, with slavery lurking in the background like the horror villain it always was. For the next few decades, tariff debates turned into America's favorite contact sport. Every time Congress brought up trade policy, it devolved into a screaming match between North and South. Northerners, building steam-powered factories and sweating through early capitalism, loved tariffs. Tariffs protected their ironworks, their textiles, their profits. They wanted a self-sufficient industrial America where you made your own goods and didn't have to rely on British imports. Makes sense if you're the one doing the industrializing. Southerners, on the other hand, saw tariffs as pure Yankee tyranny. Their economy was export-driven, King Cotton baby, and reliant on imports of finished goods. Tariffs made those imported goods more expensive and threatened foreign retaliation. Europe bought a lot of Southern cotton, but if tariffs made US goods too expensive, Europe could retaliate with their own tariffs, tanking the Southern economy. So to the Southern elite, every protective tariff looked like economic sabotage. And I mean, it wasn't just about cloth and iron. This was about cultural and economic dominance of a region that still thought aristocracy was a good idea. Southern plantation owners weren't just pissed about tariffs. They were pissed that the North was growing faster, building railroads, attracting immigrants, and industrializing. They were stuck in a feudal economy, and every federal economic policy that didn't prop up their plantation lifestyle felt like a declaration of war. As the 1850s rolled in, the tariff debate became one more log on the bonfire of national disunion. Alongside slavery, territorial expansion, fugitive slave laws, and the balance of power in the Senate, tariffs stood as another bitter fault line. Then came Abraham Lincoln, elected in 1860 with a platform that included, you guessed it, protective tariffs. He didn't just run on abolishing slavery in the territories, he ran on the idea that tariffs would fund internal improvements like canals, roads, and railroads. Infrastructure that just so happened to benefit the North and Midwest far more than the South. In the Southern imagination, this was Yankee economic imperialism, a double punch of moral condemnation and fiscal domination. So no, tariffs didn't cause the Civil War, slavery did. But tariffs were the economic language of the deeper cultural fight. The South saw Lincoln's platform as a direct threat, not just to slavery, but to their entire way of life, their aristocratic stranglehold on power, their ability to exploit labor, enslaved and otherwise, without interference, and Lincoln's election was the final straw. So South Carolina seceded, first out the gate, just like during the nullification crisis, except this time there was no compromise tariff, no force bill bluff. This time it was war. Tariffs were never just about trade. They were about control, about who got to write the rules of the American economy, about who had to pay and who got to profit. And in the antebellum United States, that line ran right down the Mason-Dixon and all the way to Fort Sumter. Part 3. Gilded Age Griftapalooza. So the North wins the Civil War, slavery is abolished, technically, and the South is left smoldering in ruins while the Union turns its blood-soaked gaze toward the next great American tradition, industrial capitalism on steroids. Next came the More-Ill Tariff in 1861, a pre-war baby that bloomed into a post-war monster. It jacked up rates to levels that made pre-war tariffs look like clearance sales. Their idea was simple: keep foreign competition out and fatten up domestic industries, especially the ones that churned out steel, coal, textiles, and weapons. Tariffs soared, and the government, bloated from wartime spending, got hooked on this new sugar rush of indirect revenue. No messy income tax, yet no need to explain fiscal policy to voters, just make everything cost more and tell the rubes it's for national prosperity. Buy American or starve, but pay more while you're at it. This is when the Republican Party, which once had the decency to oppose slavery, transformed into the sugar daddy of corporate America. No longer the party of Lincoln, more like the party of Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, and Rockefeller. The elite industrial class ran the show, and the tariff system was their favorite tool in the chest. Here's the basic grift. Tariffs were supposedly there to protect American jobs. In practice, they protected profits, inflated prices, and screwed over consumers, especially the working class. The government wasn't just letting the market play out, it was tilting the entire table toward the big boys. Do you want to import cheaper wool, tin, or sugar? Too bad. We've got a lobbyist from every one of those industries stuffing congressional pockets like they're playing Monopoly with real people's livelihoods. The infant industry argument was still the go-to excuse. We must protect our young industries from foreign competition. They said this for decades, long after those so-called infants had become gargantuan corporate empires with monopoly power and blood on their hands. At a certain point, you gotta admit the infant is now a full-grown warlord. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 jacked up the average duty to nearly 50%, one of the highest peacetime tariff rates in U.S. history. It covered everything from textiles to tin plates to the shoelaces on your own damn boots. It was the ultimate corporate giveaway. A legal wall that locked in monopoly prices and forced Americans to buy overpriced domestic goods whether they wanted to or not. And guess what? People noticed. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. The 1890 midterms were a bloodbath for the GOP. They lost over 90 seats in the House. But just like a cockroach in a tuxedo, William McKinley scurried back in 1896, this time as a presidential candidate, pushing high tariffs like a used car salesman with a quota. He had the full backing of industrial titans like Rockefeller and Carnegie, who didn't just support him ideologically, they financed him like a startup with a guaranteed monopoly. So McKinley wins, tariffs stay, prices remain high, and corporate America throws a victory party that lasts another generation. But out on the plains and prairies, American farmers are getting absolutely obliterated. They're forced to buy farm equipment and manufactured goods at inflated tariff-protected prices while selling their grain and cotton into glutted, underpaid global markets. It's the worst of both worlds. Pay more, earn less. The farmer became the collateral damage of America's protectionist love affair. Out of this agony emerged the populist movement, a ragtag coalition of agrarians, laborers, and progressives who were sick of being bent over by railroads, banks, and tariff policy. They demanded a radical overhaul, lower tariffs, railroad regulation, currency reform, and democracy that actually worked for regular people. The populists weren't perfect, let's not kid ourselves. There was plenty of racism and reactionary garbage in the mix, but their economic analysis was dead on. They saw the tariff system for what it was, a legalized extraction extraction machine, transferring wealth upward while hiding behind flags and buzzwords. And Congress? Oh, Congress was a swamp before it was cool. Tariff legislation became a high-stakes auction where industries would send in their hired goons, lobbyists, to bid for protective rates. Sugar gets a tariff, wool gets a tariff, tin, iron, chemicals, you name it, it got a special clause. The tariff schedule read less like policy and more like a bribe ledger. A congressional ear could be bought for the price of a nice dinner and a campaign contribution. There were no regulatory bodies, no ethics committees with teeth, and definitely no shame. Even progressive voices in this era, like William Jennings Bryan, the Cross of Gold guy, centered tariff reform as a moral crusade because it wasn't just about economics, it was about fairness. Tariffs were the disguised class war, an extra tax on the people least able to pay, all to enrich the monopolists least in need of protection. By the early 1900s, cracks started to show. Public anger was rising. Muckraking journalists exposed the sausage-making of tariff legislation, the corruption, the revolving door between industry and Congress. The progressive era had arrived, and with it came calls for real tax reform, not just tweaks to the tariff code, but the introduction of an entirely new system, one that could actually tax wealth and not just consumption. That's when the seeds were planted for the next revolution, the income tax, which would come crashing in by 1913 and change everything. But in the Gilded Age, it was tariffs all the way down, and if you couldn't afford a coat in the winter, well, that's just the price of patriotism, pal. Part 4, the Income Tax Revolution. Then came 1913, a year of miracles and nightmares depending on how much money you had stuffed under your monocle. After over a century of arguing, protesting, and occasionally threatening to secede over how Uncle Sam should fund his ever-expanding empire, the US finally said, you know what, maybe robbing people at the border isn't the most elegant solution. Then we got the 16th Amendment, the one that legalized the federal income tax and forever changed the game. No longer would the government rely solely on tariffs to fill its coffers. Now it could just reach into your wallet directly, like a pickpocket in a suit. And surprise, this wasn't some radical socialist fever dream. It was passed with broad support, even among some business elites who were sick of unstable revenue and preferred a more modern approach to taxation. Of course, they assumed they could rig the system later, and while they weren't wrong, that same year, the Revenue Act of 1913 landed like a thunderclap. Tariffs were slashed across the board, especially on consumer goods, and a modest income tax was imposed on the wealthiest Americans. Emphasis on modest. We're talking 1% on income over $3,000, which was really decent money back then, and a maximum rate of 7% on incomes over $500,000. To most Americans, this was a theoretical tax on guys named Cornelius who lived in castles. Naturally, the robber barons lost their goddamn minds. They wailed into their top hats, clutched their monocles, and began funding think tanks to explain why taxing the rich was somehow un-American. How dare the government stop using poor people's consumption as a piggy bank, and targeting the unearned wealth? Outrageous! But somehow, the reform held. For the first time, the federal government had a stable, progressive revenue stream, one that didn't require torching trade relationships or punishing working-class families for buying foreign shoes. This was a quiet revolution, not just in how revenue was raised, but in who bore the burden. Unfortunately, World War I came along, and with it, the federal budget ballooned like a ticker tape parade on steroids. Suddenly, the government needed real money, fast. Tariffs were hiked again, because of course they were, but income taxes did the heavy lifting. The top rate went from 7% to a brain-melting 77% by the end of the war. Yes, 77%. And somehow, though, the Republic did not collapse. This was peak patriotic sacrifice energy. The rich grumbled, but mostly paid up, and tax revenue flowed in. For a moment, the United States was experimenting with something radical, redistribution that didn't involve burning down towns. But like all good things in America, it didn't last. A few years after the war ended, the 1920s came in like a libertarian fever dream. Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge rolled into office backed by oil barons and anti-tax ideologues who thought the government should be small enough to drown in bathtub gin. They slashed income taxes across the board, especially for the rich, because trickle-down economics hadn't been thoroughly debunked yet, and whittled the top rate down to 25% by 1925. They claimed it was about growth and efficiency. In reality, it was a grand old redistribution from bottom to top, and despite slashing tariffs again in the mid-1920s, their laissez-faire fantasy created a bubble economy built on cheap credit, deregulation, and stock market cocaine. You could get rich by flipping real estate or buying stocks on margin. What could possibly go wrong? Well, 1929 came and the bubble popped like an over-leveraged champagne cork. Enter Smoot-Hawley, aka the worst economic decision of the interwar period, and that's saying something. In 1930, with the economy already in freefall, Congress decided to double down on stupid. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. Their reasoning? Protect American jobs by making foreign goods more expensive. The result? Global retaliation, collapsing exports, and a world economy that nosedived straight into hell. It was the legislative equivalent of setting your house on fire because it was cold. Everyone hated it. Economists, farmers, trading partners, even some businesses that begged Congress not to pass it. But it didn't matter. Bipartisan idiocy carried the day. Both parties wanted to do something, and as usual, something meant jacking up tariffs and praying it worked. Spoiler, it didn't. As the Great Depression deepened, international trade ground to a halt. Exports dropped by over 60%, unemployment soared, and Smoot-Hawley became a global punchline, a cautionary tale for future generations that they would absolutely ignore again in the 21st century. Then, at long last, came FDR, elected in 1932 by a landslide of people who were tired of living in shantytowns and eating boot soup. Roosevelt took one look at the tariff system and said, no thank you. Through the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, Roosevelt and his brain trust changed the game. Instead of having Congress micromanage every tariff rate like it was a medieval guild charter, the president was now empowered to negotiate bilateral trade deals. Tariffs were lowered in exchange for reciprocal concessions, and for the first time, trade policy became flexible, strategic, and, dare I say, functional. This wasn't just about economics, it was about politics. FDR needed to rebuild the economy without blowing up the budget, and lowering tariffs helped expand markets for American goods without slamming the poor with indirect taxes. It also helped the United States build alliances and carve out a leadership role in global trade before World War II reshuffled the entire deck. So the result? Slowly, painfully, the economy began to recover, not just because of tariffs, but because America finally started treating economic policy like a tool instead of a weapon. And so the age of high tariffs ended, sort of. They'd come back, of course, like a bad rash or a Bush presidency, but for now, the income tax reigned supreme, and the tariff had been tamed. The government had discovered something wild, that taxing wealth was more efficient, more stable, more just than gouging the working class for buying imported jam. The revolution was here, for now. Part 5. Post-war trade liberalization and the Rust Belt funeral. After World War II, the United States emerged like the only sober guy at a global house party that just burned to the ground. Europe was rebel. Japan was radioactive. The USSR was busy turning Eastern Europe into its own personal escape room. And the United States? Oh, we were just sitting pretty, with half the world's industrial capacity, a military on steroids, and a domestic economy that hadn't been carpet-bombed into the Stone Age. This gave us not just the power, but the gall to start preaching the virtues of free trade. Our version of it, of course. You see, we didn't so much practice what we preached as we performed a sleight of hand trick. With one hand, we signed onto the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947, pledging to reduce trade barriers in the name of global prosperity. With the other hand, we shoveled billions of dollars into our own industrial base through subsidies, tax breaks, and contracts fattened by Cold War paranoia. Free trade for thee, but corporate welfare for me. Then came the Marshall Plan, a $13 billion Help Europe Rebuild initiative, which just so happened to double as a way to secure loyal markets for American exports and keep European socialism from spreading faster than McCarthy's paranoia. We sent over money, machines, and plenty of moralizing. In return, we got allies who bought our stuff and didn't fall in love with the hammer and sickle. Everyone wins, right? Except maybe the American worker who didn't realize the golden age had an expiration date. Back home, the 1940s through early 60s were what economists now call the Trent Gloriouses, 30 glorious years of post-war growth. American factories were running hot. Unions actually had teeth, and CEOs hadn't yet figured out they could make more money firing everyone and outsourcing the rest to a sweatshop. This was the illusion of shared prosperity. Blue-collar workers bought homes, sent kids to college, and maybe even took a vacation once a year. This was a time when a single income could support a family of 4 and still leave room for a Ford, a fridge, and a future. We told ourselves this was capitalism at its best, but what it really was capitalism with training wheels, propped up by protectionism, regulation, and a carefully curated world built in our post-war dominance. But like every American dream, this one was built on a ticking clock. By the 1970s, those golden gears started grinding to a halt. While GATT rounds continued shaving down tariffs like they were sculpting Mount Globalization, American corporations began quietly moving production overseas. Why pay a union welder in Cleveland a living wage when you could pay a child in Jakarta a handful of rice and a promise not to bomb their village? And let's not forget the role of Nixon killing the Bretton Woods system in 1791. Untethered untethering the dollar from gold and plunging the world into currency chaos. Suddenly, it wasn't just goods that were floating around the world, it was entire industries. Capital became borderless, labor didn't. Guess who got screwed? By the late 70s, the industrial heartland, the engine that won the war and built the middle class, started turning into an open-air museum of shattered promises. Detroit, once the crown jewel of American manufacturing, became a case study in decline. Pittsburgh, the steel titan, was gutted like a fish. Entire towns were flattened, not by bombs, but by balance sheets. They called it deindustrialization, but that's the sterile term. What it really meant was that millions of working-class families watched their livelihoods vanish because some McKinsey ghoul with an MBA found a cheaper way to make widgets. In DC, both parties chanted the mantra of comparative advantage like it was scripture. Sure, we lose a few factories, they said, but look at how cheap your toaster is now, as if anyone built a life around toasters. The Democrats, once the party of labor, got drunk on neoliberal Kool-Aid and decided their new base would be knowledge workers and coastal professionals. The Republicans, they clung to trickle-down economics like a life raft, deregulating everything in sight while selling off the New Deal brick by brick. And while they bickered, corporations raked it in. CEO pay skyrocketed. Stock buybacks became the new national pastime. And the same companies that once stood as pillars of American prosperity now existed only as logos and shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Unions? Crushed. Wages? Stagnant. Environmental standards? Outsourced. The Rust Belt didn't just die, it was executed, slowly and painfully, while the political class argued over the best way to hold the gun. And so, the age of American manufacturing ended not with a bang, but with the whimper of a call center employee asking if you've tried turning it off and on again. Part 6. Trump, Biden, more Trump, and the art of the tarificial war. Welcome to the modern era, where economic policy is announced via Twitter meltdowns, memes, and press conferences that feel like hostage videos. This is the era where tariffs, the dusty relics of 19th century economic nationalism, got dragged out of the crypt, rebranded as tough love, and weaponized as a blunt force populist cudgel by a man whose understanding of global trade could fit inside of a Cracker Jack box. Enter Donald J. Trump, 2016. The self-declared tariff man, that's not a joke, he called himself that multiple times, in public, with cameras rolling. Trump didn't just bring tariffs back, he mainlined them into the American bloodstream like economic fentanyl. In his mind, the US wasn't running a trade deficit because of structural shifts in global manufacturing or decades of bipartisan neoliberal policy. No, it was because the other countries were laughing at us, cheating us, and winning. All crimes punishable, apparently, by jacking up import taxes on Canadian aluminum. Trump's trade war started with China, because what better way to solidify your tough guy image than by poking the world's second largest economy with a tariff-shaped stick. He imposed levies on hundreds of billions in Chinese goods. Everything from industrial components to toys to consumer electronics. China retaliated, as anyone with a brain could have predicted, and soon we were locked in a tit-for-tat tariff brawl that did nothing to bring back jobs but managed to torch American agriculture, spike prices, and send manufacturers scrambling like cockroaches under a Walmart light. Farmers, squeezed by the retaliatory tariffs, were handed billions in subsidies, corporate welfare dressed up as patriotism. Soybeans rotted in silos. Supply chains snarled. American consumers paid more. Economists yelled into the void. Trump declared victory anyway. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, things got even dumber. Instead of rethinking trade policy in the face of a global economic collapse, Trump doubled down. He pushed Buy American orders like they were holy scripture, while US businesses begged for access to global supply chains that had been reduced to chaos and back orders. Tariffs stayed. Prices rose. The deficit ballooned anyway. But hey, he said China in a mean voice, so the base ate it up. Then it's 2021. Here comes Joe Biden. Surely you thought the self-styled adult in the room would roll back Trump's toddler with a blowtorch trade policies, right? Wrong. Biden took one look at the pile of smoldering tariffs, nodded solemnly, and said, let's just keep the fire going, but maybe wear suits while doing it. He kept Trump's China tariffs, not because they worked, they very much didn't, but because removing them would look weak on China, and Democrats would rather choke on a bad policy than hand Republicans a Fox News chyron that says Biden surrenders to Beijing. Political optics won again, economics lost again. Biden wasn't entirely asleep at the wheel, though. His administration launched something Trump never could have dreamed of: actual industrial policy. The Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and massive clean energy investments. Real attempts to reshore manufacturing and compete with China, not by screaming, but by building. Steelworkers didn't get tweets, they got factory incentives. It was FDR cosplay, sure, but at least the costume fit better. The Trump-era tariffs were still still there. Even when inflation started hitting like a brick through a window, even when American families were budgeting like wartime peasants, Biden clung to those tariffs like they were his magical aviator glasses of courage. It wasn't about what worked, it was about what looked tough. We live in the era of vibes-based governance, where removing a failed policy is politically riskier than maintaining a smoldering dumpster fire. Now, it's 2025, and surprise, somehow, Trump is back, like the herpes you get from a golden toilet. On January 20th, 2025, Trump is sworn in for his second term, looking like a bloated Bond villain who just won a country in a poker game. In his inaugural address, wedged between his promises to declare a national emergency at the border, take the Panama Canal, and rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, he promised to tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens, which is code for strap the US economy to a rocket and see where it crashes. He paints a glorious vision where every problem from inflation to erectile dysfunction is solved by punishing imports until they beg for mercy. Barely a week into the job, Trump starts lobbing economic threats like they're baseballs at a carnival booth. Via Truth Social and a sweaty press briefing next to a golden eagle statue, he vows steep tariffs on key trade partners, which is MAGA speak for anyone who doesn't personally flatter me. He doesn't announce specifics, just enough to make international markets flinch and send economists reaching for their stress balls. By February 1st, 2025, Trump makes it real. He signs an executive order under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law meant for actual emergencies, not ego meltdowns. The order slaps a 10% tariff on Chinese imports and a 25% tariff on goods from Mexico and Canada. The justification? National security, because apparently avocados and Canadian maple syrup now pose existential threats. It's protectionism with a shotgun and a blindfold. The international blowback is immediate. Mexico and Canada respond with the diplomatic equivalent of, "Are you serious right now?" Leaders from both countries remind Trump that tariffs are a two-way street and gently suggest he stop lighting matches in the fireworks factory. China announces 15% tariffs on US coal and liquefied natural gas, as well as a 10% tariff on crude oil and agricultural machinery, large displacement cars, and pickup trucks, set to take effect the month after. After a weekend of golf and reportedly yelling at his television, Trump agrees to a 30-day pause on the Canada and Mexico tariffs, because even he knows that crashing NAFTA 2.0 before Valentine's Day might look bad on Fox News. The next month, at the same time China's tariffs targeting the United States go into effect, Trump also announces a 25% tariff on all the steel and aluminum imports into the country. The month after, Trump once again announces 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, this time with some exceptions, and an additional 10% tariff on Chinese imports, bringing the total to 20%, which China counters the same day with a 10 to 15% tariff on US agricultural imports. Trump then announces 25% tariffs on automobiles and auto parts to take place in April and May, respectively. April 2nd became what he would refer to as Liberation Day, complete with flags, eagles, a blaring Lee Greenwood remix, and a speech so jingoistic it could make the statues in the National Mall wince. From the Rose Garden, surrounded by sycophants and confused garden staff, Trump unveils his masterstroke in economic aggression, an executive order he describes as historic. No one asks him if he's read a history book. Here's what's in it: a baseline universal tariff of 10% on all imports, no matter where they come from, except Canada and Mexico, who get a slap on the wrist instead of a punch to the jaw thanks to exemptions buried in the USMCA. A special reciprocal tariff rate slapped on 60 countries Trump accuses of getting rich at our expense. Countries on that list include China, Germany, Vietnam, and somehow New Zealand. For these countries, the baseline 10% is deducted from the reciprocal tariff rate to find their effective tariff rate. Trump promises this will rebirth American industry. The crowd claps, the Dow Jones shudders, and the rest of the world starts sharpening its knives. The next day, China imposes a tariff rate of 34% on all US imports, matching the reciprocal rate Trump had placed on them. Trump threatens to retaliate if China refuses to back off, raising their tariff rate to 104% the day after. In retaliation, China raises the US tariff rate to 84% less than a week later, after markets start behaving like a haunted roller coaster and foreign leaders begin treating Trump like an economic arsonist. The White House does what it does best: improvises with a straight face. Trump, now in full master strategist mode, announces a 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs, but only for the countries that haven't retaliated yet. The logic? We're rewarding good behavior, says House Education and Workforce Committee Representative Burgess Owens, as if international trade is preschool. The only nation excluded from this temporary peace offering? China, because in Trump's mind, China is somehow the bad guy in the room. Instead of a break, China gets hit harder, with tariffs escalating to a bone-crushing 145%, because winning trade wars, I guess, is punching yourself in the wallet. China, in turn, raises their US tariffs to 84%, essentially turning American ports into ghost towns for Chinese goods. As the 90-day pause unfolds, Beijing punches back with 125% tariffs on US exports, including agriculture, tech, and anything with a flag on it. The soybean industry cries in tariffs. Diplomatic talks are set to resume, but it's less negotiation and more threat exchange. Trump's team teases the possibility of lifting tariffs if nations agree to a new bilateral deal, essentially trying to bully them into kissing the ring. Meanwhile, markets jitter like a chihuahua on cocaine, and trade partners start hedging, divesting, or just pretending America doesn't exist. This is not policy, it's professional wrestling, a WWE monologue delivered with nuclear weapons taped to the back of a folding chair. He wants the tariffs and the GDP growth, the nationalism, and the NASDAQ highs. He wants to breathe fire into the working class rage engine without disturbing Wall Street's cocaine brunch. But here's the unfortunate reality. To his base, tariffs are not economic tools, they're emotional balm. They're proof that someone is finally punching back, even if the punch lands in their own face. Trump tells steel workers and farmers in factory towns that he's defending them. What they actually get is higher input costs, fewer exports, job losses, and the economic equivalent of a hangover in a burning house. And the cycle will keep spinning. Tariffs are the political junk food of American policy. Quick, loud, satisfying to chew, and guaranteed to give you heartburn later. From 1789 to now, they've been sold as silver bullets, but they almost always wind up ricocheting into someone's spleen. So here we are, 2025, still addicted to the same old trade fights, still electing men who think diplomacy is a pissing contest and that economic strategy is just yelling America first louder than the last guy. Whether it's Trump tweeting about tariffs from a golf cart or Biden preserving them out of political cowardice, one thing's for sure, tariffs aren't just policy anymore, they're performance art, and we're all paying admission. Conclusion: the tariffs were never for you. 2 centuries of tariff policy teach a very simple lesson. They were never designed for the consumer, the worker, or the small business owner. Tariffs have been the playthings of political elites, tools for financing government, rewarding allies, punishing rivals, and projecting power. From Hamilton's infant industries to Lincoln's war economy, from McKinley's monopolists to Roosevelt's recovery, from post-war liberalization to 21st century trade wars, the story remains consistent. The state picks the winners, the rich get richer, and ordinary people pay the price. So the next time a politician invokes national security, infant industries, or unfair trade practices to justify new duties, remember who truly benefits: those already sitting atop the economic hierarchy. Tariffs are a tax by another name, a levy on your wallet, your job prospects, and your future. Welcome to America, land of the fee, home of the tariff. Hi, I'm Tessa from Brain Rot News, with a few bits of incomprehensible horror for you to choke on about Donald Trump's second-term assault on higher education, a coordinated, unapologetic campaign to defund diversity, deport dissenters, and turn every university into a boot camp for conservative conformity. From stripping federal funding over DEI programs to targeting immigrant students for speaking out, to using the power of the state to silence solidarity with Palestine. And if you think this won't affect you because you're not in school, buckle up, because what starts on campus never stays there. Part 1. Trump University goes federal. The second coming of Donald J. Trump is not just a rerun of 2016 with more indictments and fewer coherent sentences. No, the sequel is bigger, dumber, and far more dangerous. This time around, he's got a target painted directly on the groves of academia. Trump's second presidency has declared open season on American higher education, and he's coming for your campus with all of the grace of a tank rolling through a book fair. This isn't some culture war flare-up sparked by a Fox News segment about gender-neutral dorms. It's a full-scale, federalized siege, a methodical campaign to turn universities into ideological sweatshops where free thought is replaced with loyalty oaths and academic departments are rebranded as MAGA ministry outposts. Trump isn't just annoyed by liberal elites, he's coming for their classrooms, their funding, and their students. His administration is treating universities like insurgent territory to be pacified, not nurtured. And the goal? Strip education of its power to question, to challenge, to enlighten, and replace it with a top-down doctrine of obedience, fear, and patriotic ignorance. The same administration that treats woke as a slur now wants to redefine what students can think, say, and learn. At the heart of this operation is a simple mission: use the power of the state to force higher education into ideological submission. That means crushing dissent. That means punishing any idea to the left of Ronald Reagan's ghost. That means defunding the future until it fits neatly on a PragerU flash drive. For decades, colleges have been the places where the next generation of thinkers, scientists, activists, and artists were forged. They were messy, diverse, chaotic, and and sometimes insufferable, but vital. They were places where questioning authority wasn't just tolerated, it was the whole point, which in Trump's America makes them public enemy number one. The administration's attack plays out on three primary fronts, each as grotesque as the last. First, under the nauseatingly cynical banner of combating anti-Semitism, Trump's people are threatening to financially cripple any schools that allow students or faculty to express support for Palestinians, question Israeli policy, or say the word occupation without gagging on an American flag. This is not about protecting Jewish students. It's about weaponizing their safety to crush solidarity movements and erase political dissent from campus life. Second, immigration policy is being retooled into a blunt force instrument to silence international students. If you're not a citizen and you protest U.S. foreign policy or show up to a rally with a sign that says ceasefire, you are suddenly a national security threat. Your visa, gone. Your academic career, canceled. Your rights never existed in the first place. Trump has effectively turned ICE into the campus thought police, enforcing loyalty to the state by deporting anyone who dares to disagree. Third, DEI programs. Those bureaucratic but essential engines of inclusion, support, and equity are being dismantled under the hysterical claim that they promote division. To the Trump regime, any effort to uplift marginalized communities is now seen as leftist indoctrination. If a university even mutters the word systemic inequality, it risks losing federal funding. That isn't governance, that's retribution. This isn't reform, it's a regime change for education. All of it is cloaked in the language of restoring balance, eliminating bias, or my personal favorite, fighting wokeism. But what it really is an effort to turn higher education into a sanitized monochrome echo chamber where learning stops the moment it makes someone in a red hat uncomfortable. The consequences are staggering. Faculty are self-censoring. Students are afraid. Institutions are caving. And behind it all is a government that believes compliance is the highest virtue an academic can have. This is not a series of misguided policies. It is a strategy. It is deliberate. It is systemic. It is fascistic. So what do? We fight. In the sections that follow, we'll drag this authoritarian agenda into the daylight, exposing its tools, its damage, and the fascists gleefully wielding both. We'll map out the stakes and the battle lines, and we'll make it clear that this fight is not just about education, it's about the soul of democracy itself. Because if we let Trump gut the universities, we're not just losing lecture halls, we're losing one of the last places in America where truth still has tenure. Part 2, Federal Funding as a Weapon. Federal funding is the lifeblood of research, student aid, and campus infrastructure, a sacred pool of taxpayer money meant to support the pursuit of knowledge, innovation, and occasionally a gender studies major who just wants to make the world suck a little less. But in Trump's second term, federal funding has been rebranded. It is no longer a support system. It is a cudgel, a bludgeon, a blunt force instrument of ideological warfare wielded by men who think Kafka is a type of cold cut. In the MAGAverse, money talks, and if it hears anything remotely woke, it walks. The Trump administration has turned billions in federal aid into a hostage situation. The message is simple. You want to keep your doors open? Fine, but you better scrap your DEI programs, replace your multicultural center with a Ronald Reagan appreciation lounge, and for the love of God, stop letting students wear masks. It's triggering their base. This is not a budgetary dispute. It is a political purge disguised as fiscal policy. Universities are being told to conform to a sanitized, government-approved curriculum, one where history is patriotic, science is optional, and critical thinking is treated like an STD. Case in point, Harvard, an institution so old it predates American democracy. It received a charming letter from Trump's Department of Education, politely suggesting that if they don't purge their DEI initiatives, change their admissions process to bar any international students openly supportive of Palestine, and institute an immediate ban on wearing masks on campus, they'll be kissing their funding goodbye. It's like a mob shakedown, but with worse hair and more Bible quotes. Thankfully, heroically, Harvard told them to pound sand, standing defiant in the face of the Fourth Reich. In a letter sent to the Trump administration, University President Alan Garber stated, "The university will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights." The Trump administration immediately pulled $2.3 billion in federal funding in response. On the other side of the spectrum, Columbia got the message loud and clear. $400 million in federal funding slashed for the crime of not disciplining students who protested genocide. Their endowment is massive. effective, but even billion-dollar institutions feel the heat when the government starts pulling levers and rattling sabers. What's $400 million between friends, right? Just enough to defund a few research labs, cut financial aid, and send a chilling message across academia. Free thought comes with a price tag. Columbia folded like a cheap suit, caving into the Trump administration's demands. This isn't just about elite Ivies, though. Public schools, public universities, community colleges, and state schools, they're all on the chopping block, in red states and battlegrounds. GOP governors are doing their best impression of Trump's tactics, threatening funding cuts for schools that refuse to parrot far-right talking points. Think no DEI, no BLM, and no teaching that slavery was bad unless it's followed by a PowerPoint on entrepreneurship. So what's the result? A chilling effect, colder than a tenured librarian's take on climate change. Faculty are censoring themselves. Administrators are folding like wet paper. Students are being surveilled, and suddenly, American campuses start to look less like places of learning and more like authoritarian playgrounds for sad little men with Senate seats and Twitter accounts. In addition, much of the war being waged against higher education is being done in the name of protecting Jewish students, which is funny considering the same administration gives speaking gigs to white nationalists, invites anti-Semites to dinner, and tolerates open fascists in Congress. Spoiler alert, this isn't about Jewish safety. It's about using Jewish students as a shield for violently silencing Palestinian voices and dismantling the last spaces in America where colonization, apartheid, or US complicity can be criticized in a full sentence. The Trump administration does not care about anti-Semitism. They care about controlling the narrative. And if that means twisting civil rights into a political weapon and using taxpayer money to blackmail universities into obedience, well, mission accomplished. The American university has long stood as a battleground of ideas, a messy, glorious theater of debate and discovery. But under Trump 2.0, it's being refashioned into a soulless think tank for empire, one where students are taught to memorize, not question, where professors toe the line or lose their jobs, and where education becomes less about the pursuit of truth and more about the maintenance of power. In short, we are witnessing the slow, methodical defunding of independent thought, not because it is ineffective, not because it is wasteful, but because it is dangerous to the people who prefer their citizens to be compliant, their students stupid, and their history books short. Part 3. The War Against Equity. In the Scorched Earth campaign that is Trump's second term, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have become public enemy number one, ranked just below drag queens and above dictionaries that define consent. What began as a bureaucratic mission to make universities more accessible, more just, and slightly less soul-crushing for anyone not born into a trust fund is now being painted by the Trump regime as a covert Marxist insurgency. In Trump world, helping people isn't just suspicious, it's subversive. DEI programs are no longer described as efforts to support the underrepresented. They're divisive, they're dangerous, they're ideological overreach, according to people whose entire ideology fits on a bumper sticker. And so, the war is on. The Trump administration's crusade to annihilate DEI is as calculated as it is cruel. Under the guise of rooting out inefficiency and restoring meritocracy, federal agencies are being deployed like ideological shock troops. They're auditing campus budgets, they're combing through grant applications, they're digging into syllabi as if they're sniffing out sleeper cells of wokeness. And they're doing it all while claiming to protect the sanctity of higher education. Spoiler alert, they're not. This is not oversight, it is sabotage. The Trump administration is intentionally weaponizing the federal government to suffocate the very policies designed to give marginalized communities, Black, brown, queer, trans, disabled, and immigrants, a fighting chance at surviving, let alone thriving in institutions never built for them to begin with. Let's talk about disability, because you won't hear much about it from Trump's bureaucrats unless they're mocking it at rallies or gunning funding for accessibility services. DEI programs have, for years, been at the forefront of pushing for accessibility in classrooms, dorms, campus infrastructure, and course design. They've advocated for accommodations beyond just a ramp or extra test time. We're talking about disability justice, accessible course materials, inclusive pedagogy, and systemic change that treats disabled students as full participants in academic life, not burdens or afterthoughts. And now, all of that is under threat. In university after university, disabled students are watching support systems shrink, disappear, or come under investigation. Offices that once fought to make classrooms accessible are being shuttered or folded into neutral student services. Funding for assistive technologies is being diverted or axed. Disability affinity groups are being told to tone it down or risk becoming a political liability, all because DEI is now considered a dirty acronym by an administration that thinks inclusion means letting Ben Shapiro speak unchallenged. It does not stop there. The administration's two-pronged approach is equal parts extortion and surveillance. First, they dangle the threat of revoked federal funds over every institution that dares utter the phrase systemic oppression. Then, they demand the dismantling of DEI offices, the elimination of cultural centers, and the erasure of any acknowledgement that racism, ableism, sexism, or queerphobia might still exist. Next comes the regulatory overkill. Memos dripping with doublespeak phrases like rebalancing campus culture and combating ideological redundancy are sent to college presidents like ransom notes. Behind the scenes, federal auditors show up demanding receipts and reassurances that campuses are purging all signs of progressive thought like it's mold in a dorm bathroom. The pressure is suffocating. University leaders are scrambling. Some are resisting, others are caving with an alarming speed, issuing limp statements about revisiting priorities, streamlining student support services, which just means we fired the black woman in charge of the diversity office and we're hoping no one notices. But students have noticed, so have faculty, and in pockets across the country, resistance is rising. Town halls are turning into battlegrounds. Campus protests are back with a vengeance. Legal challenges are in motion, and academic alliances are forming to say loudly, DEI isn't some ideological luxury. It's a necessity. It is a bare minimum, because without DEI, campuses do not become neutral. They become hostile. They revert to their historical default, elite, exclusionary, and structurally indifferent to anyone who does not already belong. What is at stake is more than office budgets and programming calendars. It's the idea that higher education should be for everyone, that students with disabilities should have access, that trans students should have safety, that Black and Indigenous students should have space, that first-generation students should have support, that survivors of assault should be believed, that education should mean something more than assimilation into whiteness, maleness, wealth, and power. And the Trump administration, they want none of that. They want to drag American universities back to a mythical golden age sometime around 1953, when professors were white men in tweed, students were obedient, and diversity meant two Presbyterians from a different zip code. They want to whitewash the past, silence the present, and strangle the future, but they have underestimated the resistance. Because DEI may be under siege, but it is also deeply rooted. It lives in student movements. It lives in mutual aid networks. It lives in campus coalitions that refuse to let disabled students get locked out of classrooms, or trans students get legislated off the quad, or immigrant students get deported for caring about genocide. The fight for DEI is not just about policy. It is about power, and it is about refusing to let that power be consolidated by the pettiest, cruelest, most violently mediocre people in public life. It is not a policy debate. It is a struggle for the soul of academia. And if the Trump administration wants to turn higher education into an obedience camp, they're going to have to bulldoze through a whole lot of students, scholars, and organizers who are not going down quietly. Part 4. The weaponization of immigration. Just when you thought things couldn't get any bleaker in Trump's higher education horror show, the regime added a new layer of cruelty: deportation as disciplinary policy. In Trump's second term, what began as an authoritarian tantrum over woke campuses has metastasized into a full-blown attack on immigrant and international students. This isn't just a chilling effect on free speech, it's a deep freeze, complete with handcuffs and one-way plane tickets. And if you think that sounds like a dystopian exaggeration, then you haven't been paying attention. This administration has made it terrifyingly clear. If you are not a US citizen and you dare to speak, march, post, or even exist politically on campus in a way that makes the MAGA base uncomfortable, you are now fair game for surveillance, detention, and deportation. Expressing solidarity with Palestine? Gone. Criticizing American imperialism in a class project? Enjoy your flight home. Writing your dissertation on settler colonialism? ICE will be your graduation speaker. Let's talk about Mahmoud Khalil, a lawful permanent resident, meaning he was legally allowed to be here. He paid taxes and built a life, but Mahmoud dared to attend a campus protest calling out US support for Israeli atrocities in Gaza, and for that, he was yanked from his home by ICE like it was an episode of Black Mirror Fascism Edition. Mahmoud is now stuck in detention, not because he committed a crime, but because he committed wrongthink. And he's not alone. Ranjani Srinivasan, a doctoral student from India, spent 4 years at Columbia studying public policy, but after showing up to a peaceful sit-in, her visa was revoked without warning. No due process, no appeal, just gone. Then there's Rumeysa Ozturk, a Turkish grad student who gave a campus talk on human rights in the Middle East. She was dragged into an airport interrogation room, accused of anti-American sentiment, and is now facing deportation. Her crime? Knowing history and saying it out loud. This is not immigration enforcement. This is a political purge with a passport scanner. It's McCarthyism with biometric tracking, and it's being carried out with surgical cruelty by an administration that sees student activists as insurgents and international scholars as fifth columnists. The goal is clear: create a chilling effect so cold that the next generation of global thinkers just stop talking. Let's not pretend this is about national security. It never was. This is about control. This is about punishing people who dare hold an opinion not spoon-fed to them by a PragerU explainer. Free speech is not under debate. It's under siege. And not in the way conservatives like to scream about when someone calls Ben Shapiro stupid. No, this is actual, tangible, government-enforced censorship. Students and faculty are being surveilled. Social media accounts are being monitored. Campus groups are infiltrated. Dissent is criminalized. Conservative media, of course, cheers this on from the sidelines, howling about leftist indoctrination while ignoring that the state is now punishing students for peaceful protest. The irony would be funny if it weren't drenched in fear and blood. These crackdowns are being justified with extremely vague language like protecting national interest and preventing extremism, which in practice means anything the regime doesn't like. A poster about ceasefires is now coded as terrorism. A teach-in on apartheid is now subversion. A poem read at a vigil becomes probable cause. Civil liberties groups like the ACLU and FIRE have been sounding the alarm, warning that this isn't just about immigration, it is about obliterating the constitutional right to dissent. But the Trump administration isn't listening. They're too busy building ideological prisons out of enrollment rosters and rebranding protest as treason. This is not just academic, it is deeply personal. Students are reporting panic attacks, sleepless nights, and growing isolation. Imagine spending your college years wondering whether a tweet, a sign, or a classroom comment could lead to your visa being pulled. I mean, imagine trying to write a term paper while your roommate is being dragged away by ICE and thrown into detention. Campus activism, the proud tradition of student resistance that's fueled every civil rights movement in this country, is being dismantled in real time. Rallies are shrinking. Protests are met with riot cops. Faculty are warned to watch their mouths or risk losing tenure. Academic discourse is being replaced by cowardly silence. And campuses are morphing into propaganda zones where only state-sanctioned speech is safe. And this cruelty is the point. This is not about safety. It is about fear. It is about making students too scared to stand in solidarity with Palestinians, with indigenous movements, with Black lives, with trans rights, with any struggle that threatens the dominant narrative. It's about dismantling the very idea that education should teach students how to challenge power instead of worshiping it. Let's not forget the broader fallout either. America has long relied on international students to power its research, innovation, and intellectual diversity. These students pay an exorbitant tuition, produce groundbreaking work, and often stay to contribute meaningfully to our economy and culture. Now they're being told they're disposable, replaceable, one wrong opinion away from exile. And what are other countries doing? They're watching this unfold, and they're welcoming the talent we're pushing out. Canada, Australia, the UK, and others are opening their arms. While the US is building an ideological moat around its campuses, Trump is handing our global academic standing to our competitors on a silver platter, all because he'd rather run a political purity test than a functioning immigration policy. This is not policy. It is persecution. It is not security. It is suppression. And it is not just un-American. It is anti-democratic in the most literal sense. When the state uses immigration law to crush student activism, we are no longer talking about higher education. We are talking about authoritarianism in a hoodie, taking notes in your lecture hall and waiting to strike. So the next time someone tells you Trump's war on education is about free speech, remind them that it is not free if it comes with a deportation notice. This has to be stopped, not debated, not politely disagreed with, stopped, fought, dismantled, because if we don't protect our campuses, we'll lose more than students. We'll lose the last flicker of freedom they represent. Part 5. The campus is the canary, and it is dying. I am not sugarcoating this. What we're witnessing is not policy. It is authoritarian rot dressed in patriotic drag. Trump's second-term blitzkrieg on higher education is not a series of unfortunate missteps or bureaucratic mishandlings. It is a scorched earth campaign, surgical, strategic, and sadistic, designed to remake the American university in his image, fearful, obedient, and aggressively stupid. This isn't just about Harvard losing federal funding. This isn't just about Mahmoud Khalil sitting in a detention center for holding a protest sign. This is about a fundamental reshaping of what education is allowed to be in this country. Under this regime, universities have been turned into ideological battlegrounds where the price of academic integrity is financial ruin. The message is clear. You want federal dollars? Then shut up about Palestine, fire your DEI staff, cancel the Disability Justice Panel, and make sure your campus diversity ends with a photo on the brochure, not in the classroom. This is extortion at the national level. This is a mob boss in an oversized red tie threatening the intellectual soul of this country unless everyone plays by his rules or loses everything. And the result? A chilling wind blowing through every classroom, tenured professors watching their words, student activists watching their backs, university presidents watching the budget bleed out while federal agents comb through the syllabi for signs of empathy. Meanwhile, the right-wing media machine tells you this is about freedom from indoctrination. But that's not it. What they really want is a university where critical thinking means memorizing a PragerU video, and a history class ends at the Founding Fathers, preferably before they admitted owning people was wrong. What they fear most is not propaganda, it is progress. They fear a Palestinian student finding solidarity on campus. They fear a disabled student demanding access. They fear an LGBTQIA+ student challenging a system built to erase them. They fear students asking uncomfortable questions about American exceptionalism, colonialism, capitalism, and yeah, fascism. Because once people start asking those questions, the fragile mythology holding up this regime begins to collapse. And they know it. So what do? We fight back loudly, relentlessly, together. It is not a time for decorum or neutrality. This is not the moment for lukewarm university statements about valuing diversity. We are not in a polite disagreement. We are in a war against the open, unapologetic dismantling of intellectual freedom. So here's what you can do. Mobilize. Contact your elected officials. Demand they denounce these policies and defend academic freedom like it's a constitutional principle, because it is. Make them say it on the record. Disrupt. Join campus protests. Host teach-ins. Occupy buildings if you have to. Nothing gets the administration's attention like a suddenly unusable student union. Organize. Build coalitions of students, faculty, staff, and alumni. Form mutual aid funds. Create rapid response networks. If they come for one department, one professor, one student group, the whole campus needs to show up. Amplify. Share stories. Elevate voices. Post the receipts. Cite sources. Break the silence with facts. Fire and solidarity. Use your platform, even if it's just offensive, to make this impossible to ignore. Be as loud as you can. Donate and support. Groups like the ACLU, FIRE, and Palestine Legal are fighting these battles in court. They need money. They need attention. They need people who give a damn. Protect each other. If you are an international student, build support networks now. If you are disabled, make sure your access needs are collectively protected. And if you're vulnerable, get loud anyway, but not alone. Because the truth is this: when academic freedom dies, democracy follows. When dissent is criminalized, we are no longer citizens, we are subjects. They want silence. They want fear. They want a country where knowledge is dangerous and obedience is patriotic. We do not give it to them. We give them rage. We give them resistance. We give them campuses that refuse to die quietly. And we remember every rally, every lecture, every sit-in are acts of defiance. And in times like these, defiance is sacred. Never forget. They can try to bury the truth, but together, we are the roots. Hi, I'm Tessa with Brain Rot News, with a few bits of infuriating Trump policy for you to choke on. Today we're diving into the Trump administration's bold new strategy for fixing the federal government, setting it on fire, and then blaming the smoke on liberals. Part 1. The Anti-Government Government. In Trump's second term, the White House has embraced a radical doctrine of governance, namely that government itself is the problem, not corporate monopolies or fossil fuel cartels. No, the problem is that someone in a federal office somewhere might be helping someone without funneling the profits to a defense contractor. And so they've launched a systematic scorched earth campaign to dismantle America's public institutions using the blunt tools of budget cuts, mass layoffs, and bureaucratic sabotage. This isn't about trimming consuming the fat, this is about extracting the organs. Guided by the unholy fever dream that is Project 2025, a far-right blueprint that reads like a speed run of authoritarian collapse, the Trump team is purging entire sectors of the federal workforce and replacing them with ideologues, loyalists, and the kind of people who think OSHA is woke. To carry it out, they've set up a ridiculously named agency called the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, because apparently this regime thinks memes are a substitute for policy. What's on the chopping block? Oh, just your healthcare, your education, climate research, disaster relief, food inspections, public broadcasting, foreign diplomacy, and basically the last few threads holding together the concept of a functioning society. Under the guise of rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse, the Trump administration is torching entire federal programs that serve actual human beings, while quietly preserving the ones that enrich the wealthy, expand the surveillance state, and militarize the border. Funny how efficiency always seems to mean letting poor people die a little faster, but let's be clear, this is not budget reform, this is a hostile takeover. It is a radical reordering of society meant to consolidate executive power and obliterate the very idea of public service. The federal government isn't being trimmed down, it's being remade into an arm of conservative ideology, one department at a time. In this episode, we're going to walk you through how this disaster is unfolding. We'll dig into the cuts, the chaos, the human cost, and the legal firestorm erupting across the country, because what's happening isn't a fiscal debate, it's a war on governance itself, and as always, the casualties are real people. Let's break it down. Part 2, Blueprint for Collapse. To understand how we got to this pit of policy nihilism where public services are shredded like classified documents in a Trump property bathroom, we need to talk about the brains behind the budgetary bloodbath, the Heritage Foundation, and their Frankenstein monster of a playbook, Project 2025. This is not just some dusty white paper passed around conservative think tanks over shrimp cocktails. This is a manifesto, a strategic guide to gutting democracy, cloaked in the language of efficiency and fiscal responsibility, but really just a cheat code for authoritarianism. If the Constitution is a blueprint for democracy, Project 2025 is the instruction manual for burning it down and replacing it with a loyalty test. Crafted by anti-government lifers like Russell Vought, whose whole vibe screams bureaucratic hitman for hire, this document lays out a vision of a unitary executive with nearly unchecked power. The plan is simple: purge the civil service, slash everything that isn't a tax break or a border wall, and centralize control under Trump's iron fist. And they say it out loud. They don't even try to hide it behind numbers or charts. It's right there in black and white. Weaken Congress, sideline the courts, and turn the executive branch into a weapon for ideological warfare. Under this plan, agencies aren't just being trimmed, they're being hijacked. Instead of career experts, we now get loyal patriots, conservative influencers, think tank interns, and probably a few guys who used to sell crypto. The idea is to replace experience with allegiance, facts with feelings, and governance with grievance. And what exactly counts as waste in this new regime? Anything that helps people who don't own a yacht. We're talking public housing, mental health care, environmental protections, disability services, gender equity programs, climate research, indigenous affairs, you name it. If it provides any meaningful assistance to vulnerable or marginalized communities, it's on the chopping block. The goal is to reduce the entire federal apparatus to a vending machine for billionaires. Insert dark money, receive tax loopholes. And what's the shining jewel in this nightmare diorama of state-sponsored cruelty? The Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. Yeah, like the adorable Shiba Inu. Because serious governance is just a meme to these people. DOGE is the Trump administration's crown jewel of Orwellian absurdity, named after a crypto meme staffed by sycophants and powered by a violent misunderstanding of what government actually does. DOGE is like if Blackwater and Reddit had a baby and gave it the nuclear codes. Officially, DOGE exists to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. Unofficially, it exists to kneecap every agency that ever helped someone buy insulin, go to school, or breathe clean air. They've taken over the US Digital Service, rebranded it as the US DOGE Service, and now deploy tech-savvy operatives who know more about NFTs than healthcare systems. That it's not just absurd, it's offensive. And don't think for a second that this is just bureaucratic tinkering. DOGE is a Trojan horse for tyranny. It's bypassing Congress, ignoring court rulings, and implementing sweeping policy changes by executive fiat. Its budget cuts aren't based on need, evidence, or impact. They're based on vibes, specifically far-right, libertarian, white nationalist vibes. The world's richest man, Elon Musk, is the person in charge of DOGE, because of course he is. Who better to help dismantle the government than a man who thinks labor rights are communism and has the emotional maturity of a Reddit thread. Doge's mission isn't to make government better, it's to make it gone. They're not interested in reform. They want revenge for every diversity hire, every climate regulation, every welfare check, and every time someone got help from a public institution instead of bootstrapping their way into a casket. What we're witnessing is not just conservative policy run amok. It is an ideology that fundamentally despises the idea of shared responsibility. It is a worldview that sees poverty as a moral failure, public service as theft, and compassion as weakness. And now it's running the country. The results? Predictable and devastating. Programs that provide housing, food, healthcare, and education are all being slashed to ribbons. Federal workers are being fired en masse and replaced with political operatives. And every day, the line between government and cult grows blurrier. This is not about budget cuts. It is about power. It is about stripping away every democratic protection, every check and balance, until the only thing left standing is the executive and the billionaires behind it. And the rest of us, we're expected to survive without clean water, without medicine, without safety nets, and without saying a damn word about it. Part 3: How to Starve a Nation. Trump's second-term budget cuts aren't just a number on a spreadsheet. They're a full-on demolition derby where the car is the United States government and the driver is wearing a red hat, blindfolded, and fueled by decades of AM radio paranoia. Let's be clear, these aren't surgical trims. These are ideological amputations. These cuts aren't about balancing the budget. They're about reshaping the nation into a libertarian fever dream where public health is a GoFundMe, education is a private investment, and the phrase climate change gets you audited. First up, the federal workforce, because why preserve a functioning government when you can replace it with YouTubers who've read Ayn Rand twice? Tens of thousands of federal employees, career civil servants who, run the actual government, have been purged. Not just laid off, purged, targeted, pushed out with early retirement packages, or just straight up fired in mass layoffs that would make a hedge fund executive blush. One round alone saw nearly 10,000 people axed from workers across Veterans Affairs, the Department of Energy, HUD, and more. These weren't high-paid bureaucrats sleeping at their desks. These were caseworkers, analysts, scientists, inspectors, and people keeping the wheels of government from flying off into the abyss. The ones who make sure food doesn't poison you, trains don't derail, and veterans don't freeze to death in waiting rooms. And who's replacing them? Nobody at all. The people above them are being replaced though, and they're being replaced by loyalists, ideologues, and government skeptics hired to run government agencies. People whose only qualification is that they once replied, "Let's go Brandon," to a CDC tweet. The result is that entire departments now look like ghost towns. Oversight is collapsing. Agency expertise is evaporating, and the private sector, people from Wall Street, defense contractors, and big oil are licking their lips at the opportunity to fill the power vacuum. This isn't just union busting, it's institutional homicide. Next up on the chopping block, foreign aid, because global leadership is pulling out of humanitarian programs during a climate crisis. The Trump administration's plan to dismantle U.S. aid is not just an accounting error, it's geopolitical vandalism. Humanitarian funding has been frozen, rerouted, or erased. Entire international programs from food security, disaster relief, pandemic response, and women's health are all gone or gutted. Their strategy is to fold U.S. aid into the State Department and let oil lobbyists decide what development looks like. Spoiler alert, it looks like a Chevron pipeline. This doesn't just make America look cruel, it makes us look stupid. Every dollar cut from global development makes the world less stable, and that instability does not stay put. It boomerangs back as war, refugee crises, extremism, and pandemics. Cutting foreign aid doesn't save money, it multiplies chaos, and chaos is expensive. And that's the point. If the administration can't dominate the globe, it would rather let it burn. In addition, Trump is taking a knife to healthcare and education like they owed him money. Medicaid slashed despite months of promises that entitlements are safe. Hundreds of billions are on the chopping block. Over 70 million low-income and disabled Americans depend on Medicaid, but apparently the new policy is get well or get out. Social Security and Medicare have not technically been touched yet, but the administration is floating efficiency reforms that are basically just quiet ways to screw over the elderly and disabled without catching headlines. Meanwhile, in education, the situation is so dystopian we had to make a whole other video about it, so see our video, Trump's War on Higher Education, but here's the quick and dirty. Federal funding for public education is being decimated. Research grants frozen. DEI programs eliminated. Title I support for low-income students slashed. Students with disabilities. Good luck navigating gutted services and restructured accommodations that amount to nothing more than hollow PR. And elite universities are being threatened with total defunding unless they agree to become fascist think tanks where diversity is banned and every seminar ends with a standing ovation for Henry Kissinger. Now let's talk science, or rather the slow motion destruction of it. The NIH, NSF, and CDC have all been gutted through budget reductions, hiring freezes, and program eliminations that could set back public health and innovation decades. The NIH's new policy to cap indirect research cost reimbursement at 15% is basically a way of saying good luck running a lab unless you're funded by Elon Musk. At the CDC, critical datasets have vanished from public access. Entire programs on disease surveillance and reproductive health are in limbo. The goal isn't just to save money, it's to break the flow of information. And the EPA, NOAA, forget it. Their workforces are being slashed, their missions rewritten, and their leadership handed to oil lobbyists and climate deniers. In some cases, scientists are being reassigned to review existing literature. In other words, stop collecting data, stop publishing findings, and definitely stop telling the public what's in their drinking water. This isn't cost-cutting, it's an epistemic coup. All of this, every layoff, every frozen grant, every dismantled program, it's part of a single, devastating strategy to weaken the state so thoroughly that public service becomes impossible. It's not just about shrinking government, it's about breaking it, and then blaming the people who depend on it for not pulling themselves up by bootstraps they never had to begin with. This is class war by budget line. It's eugenics by attrition. It's the slow, methodical collapse of public infrastructure in the name of freedom. Freedom for billionaires, freedom from accountability, freedom to suffer without safety nets. When these services die, people do too. Part 4. Public Services, Private Agendas. Now that we've laid out the ideological framework and budgetary bloodbath, let's look at how Trump's regime is gutting the actual machinery of government. This isn't theoretical anymore. These are real agencies, real programs, real people being steamrolled under the golden escalator of authoritarianism. Let's take a closer look at who's bleeding and how deep the cuts go. First up, America's foreign aid program, or what's left of it. The Trump administration's dismembering of U.S. aid isn't just cruel, it's geopolitical malpractice. We're talking about freezing nearly all foreign assistance programs, canceling billions in global aid, and handing the reins of the entire operation to Jeremy Lewin, a Doge stooge whose only qualification appears to be his willingness to say foreign aid is socialism in a meeting without blinking. They've folded U.S. aid into the State Department like a neglected side dish and rebranded humanitarianism as a weapon of political coercion. The message is clear. If your country doesn't vote with us at the UN or applaud our war crimes, don't expect vaccines, food, or clean water. This isn't diplomacy, it's extortion. And it's wreaking havoc. Food assistance programs have been delayed, clinics shuttered, and infrastructure projects abandoned mid-construction. Entire populations in the global south are now more vulnerable to hunger, disease, and exploitation because someone in the West Wing thinks helping poor people is woke. And while emergency food aid is being reinstated in select cases, likely to avoid bad press, it's too little too late. The damage is already global, and it's only just begun. In addition, Trump's war on education is back for another season, and it's somehow dumber and crueler than before. Under the new budget, the Department of Education has become less about supporting learning and more about enforcing ideological purity. Harvard is currently staring down the barrel of losing $2.2 billion in federal grants because it won't dismantle its DEI programs or turn its governance board into a Trump fan club. And Harvard's not alone. This coercive model is being replicated across the board. Institutions that refuse to gut their diversity efforts, silence pro-Palestinian students groups, or punish faculty for discussing systemic injustice are being financially strangled. The message from the administration is chilling. You can have funding or freedom, but not both. It's the kind of policy that would make Viktor Orban blush. And let's be real, this isn't about saving money. This is about creating an academic climate where obedience is the curriculum and resistance is grounds for fiscal execution. Trump's budget cuts to Medicaid are a direct assault on over 70 million Americans. These aren't tweaks, these are scorched earth reductions that would cut hundreds of billions from a program that provides basic healthcare to children, disabled people, low-income seniors, and the working poor. The administration claims they're rooting out waste, but let's be honest, what they consider waste is just people they don't care about staying alive. Under these cuts, more people will be uninsured, hospitals will close in rural communities, and states will be forced to either raise taxes or let people die in emergency room hallways. This isn't just an economic decision, it's a moral crime. And meanwhile, tax cuts for the rich remain untouched. Wall Street subsidies, intact. Defense spending, practically throbbing with growth. But Medicaid? That's the hill they've chosen to kill people on. on, this is not fiscal policy, this is social Darwinism wrapped in a flag. The Trump regime isn't just defunding the government, they're decapitating it. The federal workforce is being gutted like a fish, agency by agency. Nowhere is this clearer than the IRS, where over 22,000 workers have been bought out and over 10,000 face layoffs. That's a 40% reduction in the office, responsible for funding everything else. And what happens when you defund the IRS? Billionaires don't pay taxes, corporate fraud explodes, and people who cheat the system win, and the people who follow the rules pick up the bill. Across departments, the same story plays out. Veterans Affairs loses intake specialists, the Department of Labor loses inspectors, the EPA loses scientists, Social Security loses the people who make sure seniors get checks, and into the void, private contractors, cronies, consultants, 1,000 Eric Princes with no accountability and triple the invoice. This is a government hollowed out and handed over to profiteers. There's no capacity to regulate, enforce, research, or help. When you step back, a disturbing pattern emerges. Every agency targeted serves either vulnerable people, the global community, or the idea of a government accountable to facts and fairness. And every cut brings us closer to a government that exists only to punish dissent, enrich the elite, and grind the poor into grateful dust. This isn't accidental. This is strategic demolition. It's starve the beast with a flamethrower. And as the public sector withers, the private sector vultures are already circling, ready to charge you for your water, your healthcare, your college degree, and your weather forecast. Congratulations. You now live in a nation where every federal service is a negotiation between profit and survival. Part 5. Resistance on life support. As Trump's second term slash-and-burn tour rolls across the federal landscape, leaving bloodless agencies and privatized chaos in its wake, the resistance is finally starting to rumble. Too late? Maybe. Too little? Possibly. But make no mistake, the gloves are off and the courtroom's heating up. Because when you take a sledgehammer to the social contract, people start to notice. Congress, at least what's left of it that isn't pretending the EPA caused the Great Depression, is pushing back. Democrats, joined by a handful of Republicans who still remember what the Constitution is, are calling Trump's executive budget slashing rampage what it is: a legal authoritarian overreach dressed in a badly fitted business suit. Congressional Dems are invoking every dusty procedural rule they can dig up, trying to claw back some semblance of checks and balances. Since they can't exactly slap official subpoenas on folks anymore, they're firing off strongly worded letters demanding answers, holding dramatic shadow hearings in basement conference rooms, and basically shining the bat signal for any inspector general willing to listen. They're battling to get emergency funds actually released and using any available microphone in any committee hearing to grill witnesses on why maybe you shouldn't zero out critical programs. Because a think tank guy whispered that the National Weather Service is too woke. And the courts, bless them, they're trying. Federal judges have been busier than a Starbucks barista during finals week. They've handed down temporary restraining orders, like Oprah giving out cars. You get an injunction and you get an injunction. One judge blocked the USAID freeze, calling it arbitrary, capricious, and legally incoherent. Another ruled that you can't restructure Medicaid into a libertarian death panel just because Grover Norquist said so in a podcast. It's been like watching constitutional CPR in real time, trying to resuscitate the basic idea that the executive branch doesn't get to play God with people's lives. But here's the thing, legal victories are temporary, and the administration is appealing everything. They're playing whack-a-mole with due process while continuing to quietly bleed programs dry through delay, obstruction, and internal sabotage. Meanwhile, out in the streets, people are not sitting quietly while their healthcare disappears and their child's school closes. Laid-off federal workers are rallying in front of agency headquarters. Parents are showing up at school board meetings demanding answers. Disability rights activists are chaining themselves to the doors of government buildings. Protesters in wheelchairs, former social workers in tears, whole communities rising up to say, this is not belt tightening, this is throat cutting. Grassroots campaigns have emerged faster than a budget line can be deleted. There are town halls packed with union members, Medicare recipients, climate scientists, and grad students who haven't slept since November 2024. They're calling their representatives, they're filing lawsuits, they're setting up mutual aid networks and crowdsourcing bail funds for activists arrested during sit-ins at education department offices. This is not a passive moment. This is active resistance. And it's not just about restoring programs, it's about rejecting the ideology behind the cuts. The idea that government shouldn't help, that society should be sorted into winners and losers, that compassion is a line item to be eliminated. Former agency heads, constitutional scholars, and even a very few concerned Republicans have issued dire warnings. This isn't just policy, this is regime change from within. The forced hollowing out of agencies like USAID, the Department of Education, the CDC, it isn't isn't just inefficient, it's destabilizing. When institutional memory is torched in the name of loyalty, the government becomes brittle, easily hijacked, and incapable of responding to real crises. Imagine another pandemic, but the CDC has been turned into a MAGA merch store. Imagine a financial crash, but the Treasury Department is run by a former YouTuber who thinks gold bars are the answer to inflation. This is what happens when governance is replaced with grievance. The shift from a merit-based civil service to a patronage network of partisan loyalists isn't just dangerous, it's dictatorial. This is the kind of state structure you find in failed democracies, not functioning ones. And if you think this won't backfire, remember, when institutions break, they don't rebuild themselves, they rot. The bottom line is that the resistance is real, but the clock is ticking. The political and legal response to Trump's budgetary coup is growing, but it's racing against time. Every day these cuts stay in place, the deeper the damage gets. Every agency sabotaged, every staffer purged, every court ruling defied, it's all part of a long game to outlast the opposition and remake the government in the image of the strong man. So the question isn't whether there's resistance, the question is, will it be enough and will it come soon enough to matter? Because the longer we wait, the more this stops looking like a crisis and starts looking like the new normal. Part 6. Collapse has consequences. So we've slashed the safety net, gutted the workforce, obliterated global aid, and replaced career civil servants with guys who think TikTok is foreign policy. Surely now the economy will flourish and the social fabric will hold, right? Right? Wrong, because the Trump administration's ideological budgetary bonfire isn't just a moral atrocity, it's an economic death spiral in the making. Turns out when you got Medicaid and toss millions off basic healthcare coverage, that has consequences. Who knew? With the proposed Medicaid cuts alone, tens of billions of dollars are about to disappear from state economies. Over 70 million Americans rely on that program to stay alive, go to work, and not die in medical debt. Take that away and you're not just hurting people, you're hurting the entire economy. Sick people can't work. Families drowning in hospital bills don't go shopping. Local hospitals close. Caregivers quit. Jobs evaporate. Entire communities spiral. And it doesn't stop at healthcare. These cuts to education, social services, and workforce programs strip away the infrastructure that keeps the economy moving. Public sector layoffs, tens of thousands of them, mean less spending, less stability, and less consumer confidence. Because it turns out firing people in mass doesn't exactly inspire a bullish economy. Meanwhile, state governments are left holding the bag, scrambling to fund programs the federal government just ghosted. And in red states where austerity is a political kink, those services don't come back. They just disappear forever. It's not a safety net anymore, it's a trapdoor. Then there's the foreign aid disaster, also known as let's abandon the world and see what happens. By gutting US aid and freezing nearly all humanitarian assistance, the Trump administration not only wrecked global disaster response, but also detonated America's already dwindling diplomatic credibility. For decades, US foreign aid was the bandage we slapped on our imperialism. We destabilize a country, then send US aid in with vaccines and rice to say, oops, our bad. Now we're skipping the bandage and just watching the wound fester. This doesn't just hurt the people we were helping, it hurts us. Global instability doesn't stay over there. Refugee crises, famine, insurgencies, and pandemics all come back around. And without the soft power of humanitarian aid, all that's left is raw military force. We're not diplomats anymore, we're just guys with guns. Cutting aid while funneling funds to fossil fuel barons doesn't make us strong. It makes us radioactive. This isn't just economic policy. It's an existential crisis for democracy. When you purge entire agencies, erase programs that keep people alive, and replace them with ideological purity tests, you don't just shrink the government. You break the promise of governance. People stop trusting the state. They stop voting. They stop engaging. Because what's the point when every institution is rigged against them? And who suffers the most? The same people who always do. The poor, the sick, the disabled, the single parents, the students, the workers who just need the damn bus to run on time, the ones who don't have a private jet to fly over the wreckage. Meanwhile, the rich get their tax cuts, the cronies get their contracts, the tech bros get to pretend they're visionaries while selling off public services like NFTs, and the rest of us, we get austerity, instability, the creeping realization that no one is coming to save us because the people who were supposed to already took the buyout. This isn't the government being streamlined, it's the government being stolen, bit by bit, department by department, until all that's left is a shell of executive power ruled by the whims of one man and his billionaire enablers. The economic impact is brutal, the social impact is devastating, and the long-term damage? We'll be living with that for generations unless we tear this thing down and rebuild it before it calcifies. Because this isn't just policy gone wrong, it's policy working exactly as they intended. Part 7. What they cut, we fight for. So here we are, after the layoffs, the funding freezes, the institutional assassinations, the gutting of Medicaid, the kneecapping of USAID, the ideological siege on education and science, we can finally say it out loud. This is not policy. This is sabotage. This is the methodical dismantling of the modern American state, not to save it, but to replace it with a boot, a megaphone, and a handful of billionaires whispering in the president's ear. The second Trump administration isn't downsizing government, it's hijacking it. Thousands of public servants with decades of experience, gone. Entire programs that kept kids fed, families housed, and communities resilient, axed. Scientific research that could save lives or protect the planet, smothered with a throw pillow made of gaslighting and fossil fuels. And it's not just what's been cut, it's how. Unilaterally, by executive decree, with Congress sidelines and the courts playing defense against an avalanche of authoritarian overreach. This isn't democracy, it's managerial fascism. The result? A government that no longer protects the public, it polices it. That no longer delivers services, it demands loyalty. That no longer serves the people, it serves a movement. One that prizes control over care, ideology over reality, and cruelty over competence. But here's the thing they didn't plan for, all of us. Because while they were busy gutting the system, they forgot the system is full of people. Angry people, laid off workers, teachers, parents, nurses, students, organizers, scientists, disabled folks, people who actually need a functioning government and are damn tired of being told they are the problem. This is a moment of crisis, but it is also a moment of clarity, and clarity demands action. So here's what you do. Get loud, talk to your friends, your coworkers, your community, explain what's happening not in policy terms, but in real terms. Tell them who's losing their jobs, who's losing their coverage, who's losing their chance to survive. Hit back politically, call your representatives, demand public hearings, demand legal action, demand a government that works and a president that can't unilaterally torch your healthcare. Support the fighters. Donate to legal funds, to mutual aid groups, to unions and grassroots organizations fighting to protect public services. This war isn't won in think tanks, it's won in classrooms, clinics, picket lines, and courtrooms. Organize, form networks, build coalitions, host teach-ins, stage walkouts, chain yourselves to the doors of the agencies they are trying to erase. Let them know if they want to dismantle the people's government, they'll have to go through the people. Do not wait for the next election. Do not wait for someone else. If we treat this as just another policy debate, we have already lost. This is not a debate, it is a power grab. And the only thing that stops a power grab is power that fights back. So fight, not just for programs, not just for policy, but for the single parent choosing between rent and insulin, for the disabled veteran whose claims won't get processed because the VA office is now run by someone who thinks trauma is a weakness, for the teacher who doesn't know if her paycheck will come, and the student who doesn't know if her future is even possible. Fight for every person who stood in line for public housing, for healthcare, for school lunches, for anything to be told that's been cut. Fight, because these services weren't just line items, they were lifelines. And cutting them is not just cruel, it is erasure. This is not about left or right. This is about whether your government sees you as a person or a problem, whether you are protected or punished, whether democracy means something or not. Because when they slash the safety net, they're not just tearing pages out of a budget, they're cutting into the fabric of lives, of futures, of hope. And we owe it to each other not to let that happen in silence. Hi, I'm Tessa with Brain Rot News, here to bring you a few servings of fascism-flavored immigration policy for you to choke on. In today's episode, we'll detail Trump's second-term deportation machine, codenamed Shock and Awe, because apparently subtlety died in a border cage. We'll unpack how the administration turned cruelty into strategy, beginning with the mass raids and detentions that kicked off 2025 and the humanitarian disaster that followed. We'll start by rewinding the tape to Trump's first term. Remember zero tolerance, family separation, and the Muslim ban? Yeah, those were warm-ups. Now ICE has been fully weaponized through expanded local partnerships and militarized raids that feel less like law enforcement and more like ethnic cleansing with paperwork. We'll also explore how the administration imported El Salvador's infamous CCOT prison model, a dystopian hellscape of mass incarceration, as a blueprint for immigrant detention here in the United States by partnering with the Salvadoran government to ship our immigrants overseas. In addition, we'll go over how they're dusting off the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, a law so old it predates indoor plumbing, to justify targeting immigrants based on politics and origin. We'll walk through the terrifying case of Gilmar Abrego Garcia and take a closer look at the crackdown on immigrant students on college campuses, because apparently deporting 10-year-olds wasn't enough. Then we'll talk about what's left, what's burning, and where the resistance still lives. Because when the government treats migration like a crime and immigrants like enemies, it stops being about law and starts being about power. Part 1. First-term fascism. To understand the horrors of 2025, we've got to rewind to the Trump administration's first term, also known as the warm-up round for fascism. You know, back when we still thought child separation might be the low point. How naive we were. In 2018, under the banner of zero tolerance, which sounds like a gym policy, but was actually state-sanctioned child kidnapping, the Trump administration proudly yanked over 5,000 children away from their parents at the US-Mexico border. Toddlers were thrown into cages, babies were handed off to strangers, and the government didn't even pretend to keep track of who belonged to whom. Imagine a daycare run by ICE agents and designed by Kafka. It wasn't until the ACLU filed a lawsuit titled Miss L v. ICE that a federal judge said, hey, maybe don't operate like a cartel with access to federal resources. The court issued a nationwide injunction and gave the government 30 days to reunite thousands of kids. Spoiler, they didn't. Years later, over 1,000 children remain unreunited, because when your immigration policy is cruelty, reunification is an afterthought. And then there were the travel bans. The first version of Trump's Muslim ban came down like a punch in the throat in January 2017, banning travelers from 7 Muslim-majority countries. Protesters flooded airports. Lawyers camped out in baggage claim. A federal judge in Seattle stepped in with an injunction so fast that it almost restored our faith in the judicial branch. But Trump wasn't done. He launched travel bans 2.0 and 3.0 like they were bad movie sequels, tweaking the language just enough to confuse the courts while keeping the xenophobia intact. The final version was upheld in 2018 by the Supreme Court in Trump v. Hawaii in a tight 5-4 vote, proving once again that all it takes to ban Muslims from entering the United States is the right mix of national security buzzwords and judicial cowardice. The warnings were dire. This was a religious test dressed in legalese. Executive power had been unshackled. This wasn't about safety, it was about exclusion. Fortunately, the courts weren't totally asleep at the wheel during Trump's first term. Federal judges handed out nationwide injunctions like candy on Halloween, halting everything from the DACA repeal to attempts to strip citizenship from US-born kids of undocumented parents. The judicial branch acted like a speed bump to executive overreach, slowing down the most egregious policies. But they couldn't stop everything, and the administration learned quickly, if you move fast enough, break enough things, and invoke national emergency often enough, you can outrun the courts and leave behind a wreckage that no judge can unruin. Legal scholars sounded the alarm. Trump was rewriting immigration law by press conference. Congress had abdicated its duty and left the immigration system vulnerable to executive weaponization. The real battle wasn't about policy, it was about power. What we saw in Term 1 wasn't an accident, it was a trial run. And in Term 2, they are no longer testing the limits. They are bulldozing right through them. Part 2. Beyond Zero Tolerance. January 20th, 2025. Day 1. While most presidents are still figuring out where the bathrooms are in the West Wing, Donald Trump launched a full-scale domestic military operation against immigrants. Within hours of being sworn in, his hand on a Bible he's clearly never read, and a crowd size small enough to be measured in decibels, Trump signed over 24 executive orders targeting immigration. The language was blunt, cruel, and unmistakably fascist. America was being invaded, and the only answer is force. Not diplomacy, not policy, not reform, only force. A national emergency was declared at the southern border again, but this time it wasn't just posturing. This time, Trump handed over vast stretches of federal land to Army control, activated National Guard units under Title X, and redirected billions in military construction funds to build more barriers, more holding cells, and more legal black holes. Inside the White House, officials gleefully referred to this strategy as shock and awe. Yeah, the same name used during the invasion of Iraq, except this time the war was being waged domestically, on asylum seekers, toddlers, and struggling families. Real tough guy stuff. Civil rights watchdogs immediately condemned it. Legal experts called it an abuse of emergency powers. Immigrant communities called it what it was: state-sanctioned terrorism. But for the administration, that was the point. The goal was spectacle, domination. To make a statement so loud, so brutal, that no one would even think of approaching the border again. And if a few kids vanished in the process, collateral damage in the war for sovereignty. Within 72 hours, chaos was reality. Trump's revived zero-tolerance policy kicked into overdrive, rerouting thousands of asylum-seeking families into expedited detention. No hearings, no due process, just zip ties, bus rides, and cages. At least 81 children, some as young as 2, were deported to Costa Rica without guardians, without family, and without explanation. It was a horror show. It was a rerun of 2018 with even less oversight. Civil rights groups like RISES and the ACLU lit up social media with reports of families being ripped apart at processing centers. Parents were detained without being told where their children were. In some cases, Children were shipped off before a single form had been filed. Deportation notices were issued like fast food receipts, mechanical, indiscriminate, and impossible to appeal. It didn't take long for lawsuits to hit. Advocates cited violations of domestic and international law, including child protection treaties the U.S. supposedly still honors. Human rights lawyers described the system as deliberate disintegration, a legal fog machine so opaque that no one, including the attorneys, could locate their clients. Detention centers were, and still are, overcrowded, freezing, and filthy. The kind of place you wouldn't leave a dog, let alone a 4-year-old. Observers described cell blocks packed far beyond capacity. Pregnant women denied medical care, children crying through the night with no one allowed to comfort them. ICE predictably said all protocols were followed. What they meant was that they followed the same rules they wrote 5 minutes ago. Asylum hearings, when they happened at all, were fast-tracked through makeshift tent courts with no ventilation, no media, and no justice. Legal aid groups were locked out or given less than 24 hours to prepare. Entire families had disappeared into legal purgatory, shuffled from holding center to detention center to deportation order, with no oversight, no communication, and no mercy. Experts warned this could eclipse the horrors of the first term, and they were right to be concerned. Now the machine is faster, meaner, and stripped of even the minimal oversight that slowed it down in 2018. This is not border enforcement. It is an ideological cleansing project dressed in khakis and DHS logos, and it's only just begun. Part 3. Local sheriffs turn into the Gestapo. If the Trump administration's second term has a motto, it might as well be every town a border town, every cop a deportation agent. And no agency has embraced this philosophy more gleefully than ICE. In 2025, ICE isn't just a rogue federal agency, it is a paramilitary force with local franchises, deputized mayors, and enough Pentagon leftovers to invade a small country. It is immigration enforcement by way of Call of Duty. ICE's 287G program is a federal and local partnership program that basically turns your neighborhood cop into a junior ICE agent with a badge and a God complex. And under Trump's second term, these agreements haven't just doubled, they've tripled. It's like ICE took a look at the Constitution and said, too slow, and handed every sheriff in America a deportation starter kit. And Trump's loving it. At the 2025 National Sheriff's Association Conference, a gathering that now looks more like a paramilitary cosplay convention, he told the crowd to bring your bed space. He asked law enforcement to warehouse immigrants like it's spring cleaning for democracy. Florida, always eager to try fascism and flip-flops, now has every single county sheriff's office signed on. That is not policy, that's occupation. These are not just partnerships, they are takeovers, where routine traffic stops, overdue inspection tags, and broken taillights become entry points into a federal deportation pipeline. It is not just who's doing the enforcement, it's how. ICE raids in 2025 do not look like law enforcement, they look like a military invasion. Picture this, pre-dawn raids, full SWAT regalia, surplus MRAPs from Afghanistan rolling down suburban cul-de-sacs, surveillance drones circling overhead like buzzards, and agents armed with AR-15s, body armor, and impunity. Warrants? Why bother with a judge when you have military-grade toys and a green light from the White House? The damage is off the charts. Property destruction, traumatized children, and wrong door raids where ICE grabs U.S. citizens, detains them for days, and then says, oops, our bad, paperwork error. These are not isolated incidents. They are the rule, not the exception. If you live in a targeted community, your front door is one knock or one drone flyover away from being a war zone. And if you report it, good luck, because no one is listening. Not when the raid was by the book. A book ICE wrote themselves, edited with a Sharpie, and laminated in blood. The result of all this is that entire neighborhoods are living in a state of siege. Trust in local police is gone. Reporting a crime now risks deportation. Asking for help is an act of courage or desperation, and the impact goes far beyond the immediate arrest. In Chicago, 22 people, including a U.S. citizen, have filed a federal lawsuit after being unlawfully detained in ICE suites, racial profiling, no-knock entries, and Fourth Amendment violations stacked like pancakes. It is not law enforcement, it is collective punishment by zip code and skin tone. Schools are not spared either. According to the American Federation of Teachers, ICE raids near schools have turned classrooms into trauma zones. Kids stop showing up. Teachers report emotional breakdowns in class. Student trust evaporates, and education collapses under the weight of fear. And behind it all, ICE's internal plans leaked through ACLU litigation show a proposed $45 billion expansion of the detention network. Not healthcare, housing, or mental health. No, they want more detention centers, more beds, more contracts with for-profit prison companies that measure success by how many bodies they can cram into concrete boxes. This is not public safety. This is the infrastructure for totalitarianism. The goal is clear. Make life unlivable for brown people. Push them out, lock them up, scare them silent, and make sure that any resistance is buried beneath armored boots and non-disclosure agreements. This is immigration policy as counterinsurgency, and the battlefield is your neighborhood. Part 4. The U.S. deports its conscience. When the Trump administration ran out of cages, it outsourced the problem. And what better partner for that than El Salvador's Nayib Bukele, the strongman president whose state of exception is basically just a martial law dressed in a bomber jacket. Trump didn't just endorse Bukele's prison industrial fantasy, he made it the blueprint. Under a new U.S.-El Salvador agreement signed in April 2025, the U.S. is now shipping migrants, asylum seekers, and even lawful residents to CICOT, El Salvador's infamous mega prison, a concrete tomb designed to erase people from memory and legal record. If that sounds too dystopian to be real, congratulations. You're still clinging to the idea that this country has legal guardrails. Bukele's state of exception, in place since 2022, suspends constitutional rights under the pretense of fighting gangs. In reality, it is just mass incarceration with better optics, with tens of thousands of people thrown into cells without trial, charge, or sunlight. Trump calls it strong leadership. His second-term immigration framework doesn't just praise Bukele's model, it adopts it, using it to justify the extraterritorial incarceration of migrants. Think Guantanamo Bay, but hotter, more crowded, and run by someone who tweets like an NFT scammer. At a White House meeting, Trump reportedly told Bukele they'd need to build 5 more places to house deportees, including U.S. citizens convicted of violent crimes. Because when the courts get in the way, why not just subcontract your cruelty to someone with fewer laws and better barbed wire? The CICOT agreement, signed in April, allows U.S. immigration officials to classify people as alien terrorists and fly them, with no hearing and no appeal, straight to El Salvador. Some weren't even supposed to be deported. They were mid-transfer to U.S. detention centers when ICE rerouted the flights to San Vicente, citing the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 like it's still the quasi-war. Among the first shipped out were asylum seekers, green card holders, and people with pending legal claims. White House officials defended it as a way to alleviate overcrowding. But you don't fix a leaky roof by dumping your family in a gulag. Critics, including basically every human rights organization on Earth, called it what it is: outsourced torture, bought and paid for with American tax dollars. So what happens inside of CICOT? Torture. That's not a metaphor or hyperbole. Real, documented torture. Human Rights Watch confirms the use of stress positions, beatings, sexual violence, and prolonged sensory deprivation. Detainees held incommunicado for weeks with no lawyers, calls, or daylight. Amnesty International reports forced disappearances, men locked in isolation, names erased from registries, families kept in the dark, no visitation rights, no hearings, just a bureaucratic black hole. PBS NewsHour showed footage of cells meant for 50, housing over 200 men. No beds, no sanitation, no medicine, just the heat, the rot, and the slow, grinding erasure of humanity. This is the place where America now sends people when due process becomes inconvenient. CICOT is not a detention center. It's an experiment in carceral authoritarianism, and now it's part of U.S. immigration policy. ICE comes without warning, without warrant, without real documentation at all. They just knock on your door, and all your family is left with is silence. Legal experts warn that sending people to CICOT violates international law, specifically the principle of non-refoulement, which prohibits sending people to countries where they will face torture. The Trump administration shrugs. They have their black site, they have their planes, they have the legal fig leaf of an 18th century law, and a friendly dictator with room to spare. This is not just a moral, it is a blueprint. If this stands, it will be used again on immigrants, on activists, on citizens. CICOT is the canary. The cage is already being built. Part 5. Outdated laws, modern cruelty. If you've ever wondered how a country slides from democracy into tyranny, here's your answer. It dusts off a 227-year-old law written by powdered wig aristocrats during a war that technically never happened, and uses it to deport desperate people with no trial, no notice, and no way back. Welcome to 2025, where the Trump administration has revived the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, a statute originally designed to target French spies during the Quasi-War, and repurposed it into a weapon of mass deportation. In March, ICE agents quietly began handing out English-only notices to men detained in the Bluebonnet Detention Center in Texas. These weren't court summonses, they were deportation orders, final, irrevocable, and effective in 24 hours. Many of the recipients were Venezuelan migrants, accused of gang affiliation based on nothing more than tattoos, rumors, or inclusion in the outdated registry so flawed they make MySpace look cutting edge. These men were not criminals. Many were asylum seekers, survivors of political violence, or just unlucky enough to be born under a regime Trump doesn't like. But under the Alien Enemies Act, that's all it takes. No court, no lawyer, no due process. By mid-March, over 130 Venezuelans had been disappeared, shipped out of the country, and dumped into El Salvador's Sicat prison, where they joined the growing population of people the United States has decided don't deserve rights anymore. The Alien Enemies Act is a constitutional time bomb, passed in 1798 during one of America's earliest freakouts about immigrants. It gives the president unchecked power to detain or deport people from enemy nations during times of war. It's only been invoked 3 times before 2025, during actual declared wars, not wars dreamed up by the president during a post-Big Mac blood sugar spike. Trump doesn't care. Under his reading of the law, a migrant fleeing an authoritarian regime can be labeled an enemy combatant. If they make the wrong hand gesture or have a cousin in the wrong WhatsApp group, that's it. They're gone. This law was never meant to survive the 18th century, but it has, and now it's being used to dismantle due process in real time. To their credit, the judiciary tried to slam the brakes. Federal Judge James Boasberg issued an injunction in March, barring further deportation under the Alien Enemies Act. He even threatened contempt charges if officials kept sending people to Sicat. But the administration just kept going. On April 18th, the Supreme Court issued a stay to block more removals, an emergency order to pause the madness. But by then it was too late. Many had already been placed in El Salvador. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals found probable cause to hold the administration in contempt for violating its orders. ACLU lawyers, fighting on multiple fronts, filed emergency suits including GFF v. Trump, AARP v. Trump, and ASR v. Trump, trying to get anyone to care that people were being sent to foreign prisons without legal review. But the Trump administration has made it clear it does not answer to the courts. Abroad, the alarm bells are deafening. Human Rights Watch calls these transfers a violation of international law, documenting torture, incommunicado detention, and disappearances. Amnesty International calls the policy unlawful and inhumane, warning that detainees face conditions that meet every definition of cruel, degrading treatment. France 24 has dubbed Sicat a black hole, where U.S. deportees vanish with no oversight, no records, and no return. Even Amnesty Canada has issued an urgent action, begging the United States to stop exporting people to death traps. But here at home, most media outlets barely blink. This isn't immigration enforcement. This is a legal rendition. It's the government declaring that if they label you enemy, your rights disappear, and so do you. The Alien Enemies Act has become the administration's legal cheat code, a magic trick where people are made to vanish, and the Constitution is the curtain pulled shut behind them. This is the line in the sand, and they've crossed it. Part 6, the terrorism lie and the expiration of rights. If you want to understand just how broken, vindictive, and lawless the Trump administration's second-term immigration regime has become, you don't need a stack of policy memos or a flowchart from the Heritage Foundation. You need one single name: Gilmar Abrego Garcia. Gilmar's story is the smoking gun, the canary in the prison cell, the human cost of a system built not to protect, but to disappear. Let's start with the basics. Gilmar Abrego Garcia fled gang violence in El Salvador in 2011 in order to protect his family's business as well as their lives. He was given a simple choice: join the local gang or forfeit their protection. His father, a former officer of the law, tried his best to intervene, but there was nothing he could do. Gilmar was forced to flee to America to keep himself and his family safe. In 2019, a U.S. immigration judge agreed. Gilmar had a credible, well-founded fear of persecution. He was granted withholding of removal, a legal status that doesn't give you a green card, but it does make it illegal for the government to deport you to the country trying to kill you. Since then, Gilmar built a life here. He married a U.S. citizen. He became a father. He helped raise his stepkids. He paid taxes. He had a home. He had roots. He wasn't hiding. He was not evading. He was protected on paper. And then came 2025. Gilmar's name appeared on an ancient, discredited gang registry from Prince George's County, Maryland. It had been publicly discredited for years for its racial bias, sloppy methodology, and a total disregard for due process. ICE doesn't care, because in 2025, all they need is a whisper, a hint, or a rumor, and suddenly, Gilmar, a man with no criminal record and a legal right to stay, was reclassified as an alien terrorist under the Alien Enemies Act. From there, things moved fast. No trial, no warning, no appeal. Gilmar was ripped out of his life, separated from his family, and rerouted not to a hearing, but to CICOT, El Salvador's infamous mega prison where the lights never go off and the Constitution does not exist. ICE later admitted it was an administrative error. I'm gonna say that again. They accidentally deported a legal resident to a torture prison and then refused to bring him back. When the story reached the courts, the reaction was swift. On April 4th, U.S. District Judge Paula Zinnes issued a preliminary injunction demanding Kilmar's immediate return by April 7th. She called the gang allegations unsubstantiated, slammed ICE for its procedural violations, and made it crystal clear this man does not belong in El Salvador. He belongs at home with his family. The very next day, Chief Justice Roberts, being the kind of guy who thinks due process should be reviewed, issued a brief stay. But even the full Supreme Court could not ignore the madness. On April 10th, the court unanimously ruled that Kilmar must be treated as if he had never been improperly sent to El Salvador. The Fourth Circuit echoed that sentiment a week later, slapping down the administration's appeal of an order mandating that government officials be deposed about the accidental deportation, and warning, in no uncertain terms, that you cannot stash U.S. residents in foreign prisons to avoid judicial review. That's not an opinion. That's a rebuke of authoritarianism. The administration still did not comply. While courts were debating deadlines and briefings, Kilmar was being tortured. His lawyers say he was kept in isolation, denied medical care, and denied contact with his wife, his children, and his attorney, subjected to beatings and verbal abuse, starved, forgotten, and cut off from the country that was supposed to protect him. No hearings, no phone calls, no sunlight, just a man left to rot in a hellhole so brutal that international rights groups refused to send actual criminals there, all because someone in ICE clicked the wrong box and the administration didn't want to admit they'd made a mistake. This was not deportation. It was a rendition, extrajudicial, illegal, and done in defiance of multiple court orders. It was the kind of move you'd expect from regimes trying to erase dissidents, not a so-called democracy pretending to care about the rule of law. The Trump administration has sent a clear message. No one is safe. Kilmar Abrego Garcia is not unique. He's a father, husband, and community member, a guy who played by the rules of a system that turned on him the second it became politically convenient. And that's what makes his case so terrifying, because if someone with legal protection, a court order, and a damn Supreme Court ruling can still be kidnapped, disappeared, and tortured abroad, what's stopping them from doing it to anyone? What's stopping them from branding student activists as terrorists, or protesters, journalists, or even you? That's the real story here, not just a broken immigration system or a brutal prison. This is a test case for how far this administration is willing to go to rewrite the rules, ignore the courts, and dismantle the very idea of legal protection. Kilmar's name should be etched in every headline, carved into every courtroom wall, and chanted at every protest. He didn't fall through the cracks, he was pushed. Part 7. From Scholars to Suspects. If Trump's second term has a flagship immigration policy, it's this: silence your critics, then deport them. And nowhere has that strategy played out more clearly than on American college campuses, where international students have gone from scholars to suspects in record time. Forget campus free speech. In 2025, saying the wrong thing or standing near someone who does can get you dragged out of bed, shoved in a van, and tossed across a border before your lab partner even realizes you're missing. Since January 2025, more than 1,300 international students have had their F1 or J1 visas revoked, often without notice, without process, and without reason. One minute, they're logging into their CViz account to check class registration, and the next moment, their status is flagged, their access is revoked, and their futures are on ice. No hearing, no explanation, just a line in a DHS database that now reads terminated. The Trump administration has decided that national security concerns now include posting about Palestine, attending a teach-in, or retweeting someone with a keffiyeh in their profile picture. According to Al Jazeera, nearly 1,500 students at over 240 institutions in 45 states have had their visas canceled since the year began, with elite universities like Harvard, Columbia, and Johns Hopkins topping the list. Because national security is just when you harass med students and PhD candidates. An ACLU class action lawsuit is now trying to undo the damage, arguing that these cancellations violate federal notice laws. You are supposed to at least pretend due process exists. In addition, this administration isn't just revoking visas, they're arresting students on campus, sometimes in the middle of the night in full tactical gear, armed to the teeth. At Columbia University, graduate student Mahmoud Khalil was dragged out of his dorm under the newly coined catch and Revoke policy, a program where ICE agents scrape social media to find students engaged in subversive behavior. Khalil is a legal permanent resident, but that didn't matter. He was arrested, denied bail, and remains in detention awaiting deportation to a country he no longer lives in, all because his protest activity offended the regime, and he's not alone. At Tufts, Rumeysa Ozturk, a Turkish student, was arrested and detained for allegedly handing out flyers at a protest. At Columbia again, organizer Mohsen Madawi was flagged, detained, and threatened with removal. No criminal records or history of violent acts, just speech. CBS News reports that even students with jobs, research fellowships, and pending work authorizations have seen their lives upended for minor infractions or flimsy protest allegations. One missed class, one chant, or one photo is all it takes. This isn't just about a few unlucky students. It's about choking dissent at its source and turning universities into ideological checkpoints. Trump's executive order 14188 openly declares that students can be deported for illegal protest. Well, what qualifies as an illegal protest? Whatever DHS decides that morning. Meanwhile, the Department of Education is now decertifying entire universities under Title VI for allegedly failing to stop anti-Semitic harassment. In other words, if your campus lets students criticize Israel or host a Palestine teach-in, you lose funding. Faculty groups like the AAUP and Middle East Studies Association are suing, arguing this is state-sponsored censorship disguised as civil rights enforcement. This is not about protecting Jewish students. It is about criminalizing solidarity and controlling the academic narrative through fear, surveillance, and deportation threats. The branding of protesters as pro-Hamas on flimsy or non-existent evidence is the rhetorical battering ram, and it's being used not to stop hate, but to criminalize opposition. Universities are now hostages. Foreign tuition revenue is held for ransom. Schools are being forced to choose between political compliance and financial ruin. This isn't just an immigration crackdown, it's an ideological purge, a preemptive silencing campaign, a reconfiguration of higher education as a surveillance state, where ICE, the FBI, and campus police function as one. If they can deport foreign students for holding a sign, if they can lock up a legal resident for attending a teach-in, if they can blacklist universities for not punishing speech hard enough, then who's next? This is not about immigration, this is about control, and if we do not fight it now, the next protest won't be broken up by the police. It'll be dissolved by ICE agents in riot gear holding deportation orders in one hand and batons in the other. Part 8. Become louder than the lies. This is no longer about immigration. It is about whether law still means anything, whether rights still exist, and whether a person, any person, can be disappeared, deported, imprisoned, or tortured based on a spreadsheet error and a lie shouted loud enough on TV. The Trump administration has defied every level of the judiciary, from district courts to a unanimous 9-0 Supreme Court ruling ordering the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And what did the Trump administration do in response? They lied. They claimed the court sided with it. They gaslit everyone, flipped reality on its head, and kept the flights going. It would be laughable if it were not horrifying, because it is not just Kilmar. It is not just a few broken families or a stack of vanished visas. It is a coordinated effort to rewrite the rules of law, morality, and truth itself. We now have a president actively discussing the deportation of U.S. citizens to foreign torture camps. He wants Bukele to build 5 more places, not for rehabilitation or justice, just more concrete cells, more silence, and more American-made totalitarianism. Outsourced and industrialized. It is not just hypothetical. This is happening right now, and if it keeps happening, it won't stop with immigrants. It never does. So what the hell do we do? Fund the legal resistance. Organizations like the ACLU, the Immigrant Justice Corps, and RISES, they're the ones filing emergency injunctions, suing the government daily, and dragging ICE into courtrooms that still have enough oxygen for justice. They need our dollars, our signals, our voices. Donate, amplify, stay loud. Fight for legislative power. The Alien Enemies Act of 1798 is not just a bad relic, it's a loaded weapon in the wrong hands. Call your representatives. Demand repeal. Demand reforms that close the loopholes in the Constitution that ICE is climbing through like rats. Mobilize and make it unignorable. Campus groups, protest coalitions, town halls, rent a billboard if you have to. Silence is complicity, and the administration is counting on it. Name the names. Say Kilmar Abrego Garcia's name. Say Mahmoud Khalil's name. Say every name they've tried to erase. This is not about policy anymore. It is about power and cruelty and whether we are going to let them win. Because when the government disappears people against court orders, when it builds black sites abroad to silence dissent, when it tells students to shut up or be deported, when it brands protests as terrorism and law as optional, that is not democracy. That is something darker, and it is our responsibility, our duty as Americans to stop it. This has been Brain Rot News. We are watching the system rot from the inside out, but we are not powerless, we are not voiceless, and we are not done fighting. Hi, I'm Tessa with Brain Rat News, and today we're bringing a detailed overview of Project 2025 for you to choke on. A Heritage Foundation fever dream so deranged it makes The Handmaid's Tale look like a light workplace comedy. Think of it as a bloodless coup in a binder, a 920-page manual for turning the federal government into a Christo-fascist startup where the CEO is Trump, your HR rep is Elon Musk, and every meeting starts with a loyalty oath and ends in deportation. Crafted by over 400 right-wing ideologues and 140 former Trump officials, which is basically the same as saying over 540 people who think child labor builds character. Project 2025 is a day one demolition plan for the administrative state. You know, boring stuff like keeping your food unpoisoned, your plane uncrashed, and your medication FDA approved. Trump pretended to distance himself from it in public, but let's not kid ourselves. His first 92 days in office have looked like a direct-to-video adaptation of this playbook. Student loans and consumer protection have already been gutted like a dead bear RFK Jr. left in the road on his way to Central Park. Tariff hikes written in crayon and rage, you bet your collapsing supply chain. At its core, this isn't about efficiency or draining the swamp. It's about replacing the swamp with a moat, stacking the palace with sycophants, and drowning the rest of us in deregulation. So get ready for a bumpy ride, because Project 2025 is not just a policy guide, it is an authoritarian vision board, and if we do not rip it apart piece by piece, it is going to turn the last remnants of American democracy into a privatized theme park where the rides don't work and the workers don't get paid. Part 1. The Heritage Hunger Games. Project 2025 is not a policy plan. It is a hostile corporate takeover of the federal government disguised as a Microsoft Word document. It's Ayn Rand with a PAC and a PowerPoint. It's what happens when you let libertarians, oil lobbyists, and former Trump staffers cook without adult supervision. Unfortunately, they cannot cook. Dreamed up by the Heritage Foundation in a haunted mansion where every room is a think tank for making life worse, Project 2025 is a sprawling technocratic hit list designed to consolidate power, privatize everything, and salt the earth behind them. And on January 20th, 2025, Trump wasted no time getting started. Sworn in for his second non-consecutive term inside the Capitol Rotunda due to weather and presumably divine pestilence, he immediately began implementing this ideological instruction manual. From the moment the Bible hit his hand, the executive orders started flying, and buried behind every one of them was a Heritage Foundation intern with a laptop full of fascism and a LinkedIn page that said America first, DEI last. Donald J. Trump did not just win, he stormed back into office like a high-wire stunt that dropped the ball mid-show, riding a wave of backlash, burnout, and billionaire dark money. This time he brought friends, a Republican Senate, a barely functioning House majority, and a federal judiciary already softened up from round one. Exit polls showed surges in Hispanic voters, white non-college educated men, and a mysterious group labeled Vibe-core Gen Z contrarians. The Democrats, meanwhile, had apparently decided to run on quiet quitting, and while the nation rose in sub-zero temperatures, Trump took the oath inside, flanked by Ivanka's gold-plated entitlement and J.D. Vance's hillbilly hatchet face, while outside the Capitol, critics shouted about election integrity, Project 2025, and whether this was still America or just an LLC with nukes. The Heritage Foundation dropped Project 2025 like a lead balloon full of scorpions in April 2023, and by later that year, it had ballooned into a Frankenstein coalition of 100-plus conservative groups, from libertarians to full-blown theocrats. Picture Grover Norquist, Moms for Liberty, and Peter Thiel all doing shots together and drafting federal agency org charts. This wasn't just a think piece, it was a manual for control, down to agency staffing databases, HR templates, and a training program called the Presidential Administration Academy, which sounds like a fake school from an anime where the principal is Ronald Reagan's ghost. They even launched a day one playbook because democracy is when you make a detailed plan to dismantle it before lunch. This is not just a concept, it is Trump's absolute scripture now. He hasn't read it, but unlike the Bible, which he also hasn't read, he's been adhering to Project 2025 precisely. It is not reform, it's revenge. Their goals are to break the civil service, deregulate everything from healthcare to food safety, privatize the Social Security safety net, stack the judiciary, cement executive power, and bury wokeism under a mountain of white paper and white nationalism. This is not conservative governance. This is ideological demolition dressed in khakis and clutching a copy of Atlas Shrugged. Welcome to Project 2025, where limited government means unlimited cruelty and market efficiency means gutting consumer protections. Part 2. Bible of the Bureaucratic Apocalypse. If Project 2025 is the bomb, the Mandate for Leadership series is the blueprint for how to build it, light it, and drop it on every functioning agency in the United States government. Think of it as the Necronomicon of deregulation, a cursed text passed down from Reagan to Trump with one central goal: drown the federal government in a bathtub, then sell the tub to a hedge fund. The first edition released in 1981 and quickly became known as Reagan's Policy Bible because being American Jesus is when you slash welfare and let Exxon rewrite environmental policy. It worked. 2/3 of its recommendations were enacted in year one, including the Economic Recovery Act of 1981, which exploded inequality and launched the modern-day austerity fetish. Since then, the mandate has resurfaced every time Republicans get within spitting distance of the presidency, like a cursed videotape that only plays for sociopaths and khakis. The 1981 Mandate for Leadership wasn't just a guidebook, it was a manifesto in three-piece suits, crafted in the bowels of the Heritage Foundation by people who think homelessness is a lifestyle choice and Medicare is socialism with better branding. It was a plan to yank the wheel of government hard to the right, and it did exactly that. They've been pressing the gas pedal ever since. Every Republican administration since has used the mandate like a cheat code. If you want to destroy an agency, rewrite education to ban books but boost Bible sales, or demolish Social Security, there's a chapter for that. Trump had his own Mandate for Leadership in 2016, a three-part series designed to prep Congress and Trump's swamp creatures for unified conservative rule. Once again, the Heritage Foundation bragged that he had finished 2/3 of the homework they had given him, which is probably more than like any one of his teachers could have said. Then came 2023, clocking in at 920 pages. This is the Project 2025 source code, written by hundreds of policy experts who think the Civil Rights Act went too far and OSHA is woke communism. It includes not just policy plans, but personnel lists, loyalty training modules, and a 180-day demolition schedule. It's basically the anarchist cookbook, but for deregulating America into a libertarian dust cloud. From the start, Mandate for Leadership has championed slashing taxes for the rich, defunding every program that helps anyone making under $250,000 a year, deregulating Wall Street and big oil, shredding labor protections, and framing it all as personal freedom. But the 2023 volume goes further. It builds out entire bureaucratic pipelines of ideological loyalty screening for anti-woke hires and training future officials to speedrun government sabotage like as a Twitch stream. By October 2023, the mandate had evolved into a full-blown policy media ecosystem, complete with a keynote by Ron DeSantis, who probably used it to practice his human skin smile while reading aloud from Chapter 7, How to Fire the CDC. Project 2025 is just the latest in a long lineage. Every spreadsheet, flowchart, and fake patriotic slogan in the project traces directly back to this cursed text. Wikipedia describes Project 2025 as being built expressly atop the Mandate series. Critics, including The Nation, Democracy Now!, and every reasonable person with a functioning brain, say the 2025 version makes the 1980 edition look tame. This time, the stakes aren't just budget cuts, they're civil rights, bodily autonomy, judicial independence, and the future of American democracy. This is how it starts. Not with tanks, but with think tanks. And not with brute force, but with a 900-page PDF no one reads until it's too damn late. Part 3. The Four Horsemen of the Bureaucratic End Times. Project 2025 isn't just a manifesto, it's a 4-part bureaucratic death spiral with an onboarding process. Think of it as the Infinity Gauntlet for authoritarianism, 4 interlocking pieces of institutional obliteration, ready to snap half of the federal government out of existence on day one. It's published, it's been public the whole time, and it reads like someone handed Tucker Carlson, Elon Musk, and an exorcist a Word document and told them to go nuts. So, let's meet the 4 pillars of the apocalypse. The first pillar is the Mandate for Leadership, their Bible of bureaucratic arson. You already know this one. It's Heritage's 920-page manifesto telling every federal agency how to stop functioning and start kneeling to corporate America. It's like a choose-your-own-adventure, except every ending leads to deregulation. The second pillar is the Presidential Personnel Database, which is LinkedIn but for fascists. This is their MAGAmatch.com, a job board for the far right where any anti-woke warrior with a podcast can apply to dismantle the Department of Labor. No experience necessary. necessary, loyalty a must. Their goal is to purge the deep state and replace it with a shallow pool of sycophants trained to obey instead of govern. Rather than staffing, they're stacking the deck. The third pillar is the Presidential Administration Academy, an online course where incoming officials are trained not how to serve the public, but how to game the executive authority to push through legislation, gut regulations, and avoid congressional or judicial oversight. Instead of a civics class, it's a crash course in legal sabotage. These people are being credentialed in how to break democracy and write the press release after. The fourth and final pillar is the 180-day Day 1 playbook. Think of it as the to-do list from hell. Dozens of executive orders ready to go the minute the Bible thumps and the hand lifts off the oath. Within 6 months, they plan to fire civil servants en masse, end environmental protections, nuke financial regulations, and restructure every agency to obey the president without question. Democracy does not die in darkness. It dies in bullet-pointed Word documents on day one. I'm going to be blunt. Project 2025 is a war plan, and these are the targets. They want to shred environmental protections, gag the EPA, and declare war on what they call job-killing regulations. Those jobs are in coal, oil, and poisoning the water. Financial regulations like Dodd-Frank will be gone, and workplace safety will be optional. If it protects the public, it is on the chopping block. They're also gunning to gut the Civil Rights Division at the DOJ, weaken anti-discrimination laws, and roll back federal oversight of voting rights and housing justice. They're not being subtle this time around. Their policy is openly racist, openly regressive, and they wrote it down. You can read it. Social Security will be defunded. Everyone on Medicare will be forced into privatized Advantage plans where Advantage means hope you don't get sick. Food stamps, housing vouchers, and unemployment aid will be converted into block grants, allowing states to kill them quietly. In addition, they want to rewrite the Administrative Procedure Act, stripping judges of the power to review executive actions. That means if the president says, shut down the Department of Education, there is no appeal, no checks, no balances, just a CEO presidency with no shareholders, but oil companies and lobbyists. Their trade plan reads like a Twitter meltdown in policy form. Tariff hikes on everything, especially anything made in China, plus withdrawal from the WTO, IMF, and World Bank. Their idea of global leadership is starting a trade war and ghosting our allies. Project 2025 isn't governance. It's executive cosplay for fascists. It's what happens when you give libertarian billionaires a government printing press and no therapist. And if we do not burn the playbook, they will burn what's left of the public sector. Part 4. Governance by gasoline. Within weeks of taking office for his second term, Donald Trump didn't just hit the ground running, he hit it swinging an axe. As of mid-April, his administration has unleashed 129 executive orders in just over 80 days, each one pulled straight from the cold-blooded script of Project 2025. This is not governing philosophy. It's a hostile takeover. Federal agencies are being gutted like fish on a factory line, workers are being purged, and programs that took decades to build are being slashed in hours. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has been effectively dissolved. Student loan forgiveness for teachers and nurses is on life support. The NIH is prepping for a budget lobotomy, and foreign aid and international health programs have been frozen and defunded. At the center of it all is just one of the key architects of Project 2025, Russell Vought, who now controls the budget of the entire federal government. So now people like teachers, social workers, EMTs, and anyone who signed up to serve their communities, thinking that in exchange they were promised student debt relief, well, Trump's team saw that promise and ran it through a paper shredder. New memos from the Department of Education suggest thousands of borrowers may be denied forgiveness retroactively under the excuse of policy realignment. Their cruelty isn't incidental, it's intentional. Consumer protection is no more. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was one of the first casualties. Staff were told to pack up, lights were turned off, and over 1,500 jobs were terminated in one fell swoop. It was a targeted assassination of an agency designed to stop banks and lenders from preying on the public. Project 2025 wants regulatory agencies that serve capital, not people, and this was the first step. Global health and humanitarian aid is no more. On January 30th, 2025, Trump officially pulled the United States out of the World Health Organization. Foreign aid programs were paused with no transition plan, leaving famine zones and crisis regions cut off overnight. Children and mothers will die for this stunt, and the administration doesn't care. They see this as draining the swamp. Apparently, the swamp includes polio eradication and clean water. They're using blanket tariffs as a blunt force tool. For a more detailed breakdown, watch our video on the History of Tariffs in America. On April 5th, 2025, the administration enacted a 10% tariff on all imports. No exceptions, no warning, no strategic calculus, just a nationalist fever dream written into law. Higher targeted tariffs for trade deficit offenders followed days later. So if your country sends us more stuff than we send back, you're the enemy now. And while regular consumers pay more for clothes, food, and medicine, the administration quietly paused tariffs on high-end electronics, creating a two-tiered tariff regime. Punishment for the poor, privileges for the rich. The State Department now has free rein to raise tariffs up to 25% whenever it feels like, giving political appointees direct control over prices on everyday goods. Then, they went on a multilateral withdrawal spree. We're not just pulling out of the WHO, we're also reviewing funding for the IMF, World Bank, and WTO, all of which Project 2025 sees as obstacles to unilateral power. Global partnerships are being torched one by one in favor of autarky, nationalism, and zero accountability. Science is under siege. In April, the administration proposed slashing the NIH's $47 billion budget by nearly half. That means less cancer research, less Alzheimer's research, and fewer grants for life-saving drugs and vaccines. That money will now be rerouted towards public-private partnerships, which in practice means corporate pet projects and biotech companies with Trump-friendly shareholders. Internal memos outline plans to cut the National Science Foundation's funding by 50% and eliminate EPA research grants wholesale. Environmental monitoring, climate science, and chemical safety have all been deemed non-strategic. In their place, deregulated air, weaponized ignorance, and whatever else the oil lobby can cook up. They have done a personnel coup where they prefer ideology over expertise. Russell Vought, who we mentioned briefly earlier, helped write Project 2025. Now he's the budget director of the United States. Confirmed by the Senate on January 23, 2025, Russell Vought doesn't just balance the books, he rewrites them. Every agency budget now flows through an ideologue who believes in dismantling the federal government. That's like putting a demolition expert in charge of city planning. The Project 2025 personnel database, launched in 2023, has become the administration's central hiring tool. Deputy secretaries, assistant secretaries, legal counsels, and regulatory officials are now being plucked from a short list of movement conservatives with loyalty as their only qualification. These are not public servants, they are political enforcers, and they're being embedded everywhere. This is not a warning. This is happening right now. Project 2025 is not hypothetical. It is happening, it's working, and it is ripping through the federal government like wildfire. What we are witnessing is the fusion of ideology and state power, a direct assault on democratic governance, civil service, and the notion that government should serve the public good. We are not debating policy anymore. We are fighting off a hostile restructuring of the American state into a blunt instrument of revenge and corporate control, and we've barely hit day 90. Part 5. The End of Government as We Know It. Project 2025 is not a wish list, it is a blueprint for a hostile takeover, a step-by-step guide to replacing democracy with a pyramid scheme where the only thing trickling down is executive power and deregulated sludge. This thing has chapters on how to kill the First Amendment, how to privatize your grandmother's dialysis, and how to fire every civil servant with a conscience. If it were any more brazen, it would be titled Mein Kampf 2. Forget independent judiciary, Project 2025 wants to turn the federal branch into a Federalist Society frat house. No more merit-based vetting, no more ABA guidelines, just raw, unfiltered, ideological loyalty. Don McGahn, Stephen Kenny, and a bunch of dudes named Bryce will hand-select judges to fast-track every draconian law and rubber-stamp corporate wet dreams. They're planning to create 66 new judgeships through the Judges Act so that Trump can appoint over 300 lifetime judges before his second term ends. Expect these robed reactionaries to rule that bodily autonomy is a myth, that corporations are not only people, but better than people, determine that pollution is just the sweet smell of freedom, and treat precedent like an annoying telemarketer they just hang up on. Project 2025 does not want to streamline federal agencies, they want to turn them into job fairs for fascist influencers. The Department of Education will be gone. Homeland Security will be folded into some new dystopian super executive apparatus, probably called something like the Department of Obedience, and 1 million federal workers will be reclassified as at will, then fired unless they retweet Elon Musk twice a day. day. Head Start will be shuttered, nutrition programs will be privatized, and public services will be obliterated. This is revenge governance, vengeful, petty, and designed to erase the New Deal, the Great Society, and any shred of federal decency. Public sector unions will be outlawed, minimum wage will cease to exist, and discrimination enforcement will be blinded once they defund the EEOC's ability to track racism. They want OSHA gutted, because who needs workplace safety when you're already dying of despair? This is the dream, a labor force with no rights, no power, and no data to prove they're being exploited. They want the Industrial Revolution, but with worse vibes and no weekends. On top of everything else, the people who scream cancel culture every time a racist loses their sitcom are now planning state-sponsored censorship. Project 2025 wants to dismantle net neutrality so billionaires can throttle your internet unless you subscribe to Patriot TV, reinterpret Section 230 so platforms can be punished for not banning woke content, and give the new FCC chair, Brendan Carr, a Heritage co-author, the power to choke dissent at the source. This is not about free speech, it is about controlling speech, turning the internet into a filtered pipeline of right-wing propaganda, where dissent equals deplatforming and satire becomes sedition. What we're looking at is not policy shift, it's a hostile merger between American governance and authoritarian corporatism. Judges handpicked by zealots, agencies staffed by cultists, unions outlawed, dissent silenced, science defunded, workers made disposable, speech made conditional, and all of it run by a president wielding unchecked power, surrounded by hand-picked loyalists, answering to only billionaires and technocrats. Part 6. Executive Overhaul, a Manifesto for Control. At this point, Project 2025 is not a plan, it's a non-consensual restructuring of America with all the subtlety of a boot to the face. It reads like a dystopian manifesto written by a committee of CEOs, televangelists, and unmedicated libertarians locked in a panic room. This isn't about shrinking government, it's about gutting it, stuffing it with cronies, and using it to bludgeon anyone who isn't white, wealthy, or worshipping at the altar of deregulated capitalism. What they want is a unipolar, executive autocracy where the only branch of government that matters is the one Trump sits on while tweeting executive orders and sipping Diet Coke. So what's actually at stake? Nothing important, just democracy, civil rights, economic security, the global order, and whether we have breathable air in 30 years. Project 2025 aims to obliterate every constitutional guardrail, replacing the three branches of government with a single gold-plated throne. Congress is being sidelined, judicial independence is being erased, and agencies with expertise are being fired and replaced with party loyalists. They want to hand over judicial appointments to right-wing super PACs, jam the courts with hand-picked ideologues, and pass legislation like the Judges Act, which would create 66 new seats for future Brett Kavanaughs with less shame and more Twitter followers. Democracy Forward's threat matrix catalogs over 220 ways this playbook seeks to consolidate power, from unreviewable executive orders to emergency powers that never expire. Think of it as a how-to guide for legally installing a dictatorship. Under Project 2025, the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division would be gutted, because you don't need an agency defending your right to vote or exist safely if you're not rich, white, and male. Voting rights protections will be slashed, housing discrimination enforcement will be gone, and surveillance of marginalized groups will be expanded. The ACLU warns that this plan would kneecap every tool we have to fight systemic racism, while greenlighting digital witch hunts targeting Muslim communities, pro-Palestinian voices, trans activists, and anyone who's ever been to a protest or written a Tumblr post. We are looking at a future and present where your internet history gets you deported, your sexual orientation gets you fired, and your race gets you redlined with no legal recourse and no functioning watchdog agencies. Project 2025 is what happens when the ultra-wealthy look at the New Deal and scream, "Reverse discrimination." It is not about cutting waste. It is about making sure the poor stay poor, the sick stay sick, and the working class never unites again. Social Security, Medicare, SNAP, and cash assistance will all see deep cuts. Public sector unions will be outlawed, and OSHA and labor standards will be nuked. A Center on Budget and Policy Priorities analysis estimates 15 million more Americans in poverty under this plan, but at least the billionaires will save on estate taxes while the rest of us die in GoFundMe hospital beds. This is the Heritage Foundation's America, a freedom fetish turned fascist funhouse, where poverty poverty is moral failure, and deregulation is divine will. If Project 2025 gets its way, the United States won't just leave the World Health Organization. We'll be yanking funding from the WTO, IMF, World Bank, and probably the UN too. But why? Why would they do this? Because global cooperation makes it harder to act like a drunken hegemon on bath salts. The plan is blanket tariffs that trigger global economic retaliation, exit strategies from every international institution that values human rights, and diplomatic alliances replaced by raw, transactional nationalism. This isn't just isolationism, it's weaponized nihilism, where America becomes a rogue superpower lurching from tweet to tariff while China and Russia divvy up what's left of global influence. The Global Philanthropy Project warns that this retreat will shred global cooperation on health, trade, and climate, and they're being diplomatic. Let's stop calling this a transition guide. This is a playbook for fascism, and every page is a direct threat to life, liberty, and the pursuit of not being fucked over by billionaires. We are talking about the death of judicial independence, the end of civil rights enforcement, the destruction of public services, the rise of executive dictatorship, and the global humiliation of the United States as we spiral into techno-authoritarianism. Project 2025 is the final boss of neoliberal rot, the logical conclusion of decades of deregulation, austerity, and culture war nonsense. Part 7. How to Kill a Democracy in 900 Pages or Less. Let's not mince words. Project 2025 is the authoritarian starter kit, a 900-page manifesto from America's most unhinged right-wing think tank that reads like someone bet the Heritage Foundation they couldn't speedrun the fall of the Roman Empire using only PowerPoint and Coke money. This is not policy. This is fan fiction for fascists. It's the wet dream of every Liberty University dropout who thinks OSHA is communism and that public education was a deep state plot to make kids read books with gay people in them. Written by 400 conservative operatives, 140 former Trump officials, and presumably one angry sentient Chick-fil-A, Project 2025 doesn't want to rein in big government, it wants to strangle it, bury it in the desert, and sell off the bones to Raytheon. Already, Trump's second term is rolling out this nightmare blueprint like it's a Costco discount aisle for civil liberties. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is effectively gone, NIH funding has been halved, public service loan forgiveness has been dismantled, and tariffs are threatening to collapse the global supply chains. They want a government run by loyalists, funded by billionaires, and enforced by ICE in tactical gear. They want the judiciary filled with Federalist Society bots who think labor unions are witchcraft, and they want to abolish civil rights enforcement so corporations and police departments can party like it's 1953. This isn't just politics, it is demolition. Project 2025 wants to reclassify civil servants as disposable, ban public sector unions, defund Social Security, and turn Medicare into a coupon for ibuprofen. If it helps the rich and hurts the vulnerable, it is in there. If it expands executive power and crushes dissent, it's not just included, it's featured in bold, underlined, and blessed by Clarence Thomas. And while this administration claims it's just following common sense reforms, the truth is actually much simpler. They are building a government where power flows one way, upward, to white men in suits, to corporations that poison your water, to Christo-fascists in polos, and they're hoping you're too tired, too broke, and too distracted to stop them. But here's the thing, they are wrong. We are not powerless, we are not alone, and we are not going quietly. There are still people fighting back. Lawyers, organizers, whistleblowers, student activists, cafeteria workers, queer librarians, broke poets, pissed off nurses, and everyone else who gives a damn about a future that isn't ruled by evangelical crypto-fascists. So what now? Organize, unionize, agitate, donate, protest, support the ACLU, and boost every lawsuit tying these bastards in knots. Call your representatives until their interns start to sweat. Run for office, march in the streets, and crash their press conferences. Raise hell at your school board, join a strike, and start a co-op. Make fascism inconvenient, loud, unprofitable, and unbearable. Use your voice, your vote, your body, your art, your memes, your grief, your fury, and your love. Because this is not a drill, and these people are not kidding. Project 2025 might have a plan, but so do we, and ours doesn't end with a gulag. Hi, I'm Tessa with Brain Rot News, here to force feed you another helping of authoritarian power grabs and shredded constitutional norms, served lukewarm and unseasoned, just the way the Heritage Foundation likes it. On today's menu, the Bill of Rights is getting waterboarded in the basement of the White House. Part 1. The Bill of Rights Going Away Party. It's January 20th, 2025. Trump is sworn in again, indoors this time, because God himself seems to be protesting, and within minutes, the Constitution starts taking fire like it's back in Fallujah. Right out of the gate, Trump drops a blitz of executive orders so audacious they make his first term look like a warm-up set. We're talking expanded surveillance, ICE raids like it's Black Friday at a police surplus store, voting restrictions with the subtlety of a brick through a ballot box, and a new press strategy. Sue them all and let Rupert Murdoch sort it all out. ICE is back on its bullshit, but now with more bonus constitutional violations. Trump's team has cracked open the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, a law written before we started washing our hands after using the bathroom. It's the perfect tool for removing threats, which apparently includes asylum seekers, permanent residents, and anyone who ever tweeted Free Palestine. Due process is no longer on the menu. Detainees are being deported before they even know they've been accused of something. Students are learning they would be deported when their Google Calendar updates with flight to CCOT. Lawyers call it unconstitutional, Trump calls it efficient. The Department of Justice has officially gone on strike. It dropped civil rights lawsuits like hot potatoes in Pennsylvania and Georgia, where discrimination has apparently been rebranded as states' rights. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court, now a subdivision of the Federalist Society, greenlit a voter purge in Virginia based on suspected non-citizenship, which in this context seems to mean voted while brown. Trump's DOJ is now floating ideas like tying federal money to voter ID laws and proof of citizenship mandates, effectively saying, you want rights? Show us your birth certificate. All of this, of course, is wrapped in the well-worn cloak of election integrity, which is Republican for, we're losing, make it illegal to vote. If you thought calling the press the enemy of the people was bad, wait until you hear about Operation Sue the Shit Out of Journalists. Trump has openly floated defamation lawsuits as a form of media control, and insiders are whispering about press credentials being revoked based on ideological non-alignment, a term that definitely doesn't sound fascist at all. Legal scholars and press watchdogs are sounding every alarm, while Trump world treats the First Amendment like a Mad Libs page. Fill in your favorite billionaire, remove any mention of criticism. A presidency that was already allergic to checks and balances has decided to go full tilt into a banana republic. Power is centralizing, courts are being packed, surveillance is ramping up, and the law is just an inconvenient suggestion. But hey, it's not all doom and gloom. The resistance hasn't folded just yet. Civil rights groups are flooding the courts with lawsuits. ACLU lawyers haven't slept in weeks, and public interest groups are filing amicus briefs like their lives depend on it, because they do. Even some congressional Democrats have emerged from their wine caves long enough to issue sternly worded letters and the occasional subcommittee hearing. The press, too, is still swinging, even as Trump threatens to sue NPR into a silent void. We are now watching a real-time demolition derby between authoritarian executive power and the increasingly exhausted scaffolding of American democracy. If you thought Trump 1.0 was dangerous, you ain't seen nothing yet. Strap in. This isn't just another bad sequel, it's the part where the villain wins unless someone breaks the glass. Part 2. Soft launch of authoritarianism. Trump's first term was a soft launch for authoritarianism, a constitutional stress test, and thankfully the Constitution held. In his first term, Donald Trump treated the Constitution less like a governing document and more like a napkin to scribble grudges on. The press became a personal enemy, immigrants a prop for cruelty, and surveillance powers a toy to play with when the cable news cycle got boring. What wasn't outright illegal was often unconstitutional, and what was constitutional was usually ignored. Take November 2018. After a tense exchange in the White House briefing room, Trump's team yanked CNN reporter Jim Acosta's press credentials like they were kicking out an unruly bar patron. A federal judge slapped their hands and ordered the press pass to be reinstated, reminding everyone, at least temporarily, that yeah, the First Amendment still applied to people who asked tough questions. But the broader message had already been sent. Criticize the president and you're expendable. That tone metastasized. PEN America sued the administration for targeting journalists with retaliatory bans, threats, and denial of access. They warned that using public office to punish reporting wasn't just petty, it was a constitutional crisis with a press pass. Even Trump's so-called free speech executive orders, wrapped in patriotic branding, aimed to not protect dissent, but to intimidate social media companies into becoming megaphones for state propaganda. Then, Trump reauthorized Section 702 of FISA, an expansive surveillance tool that lets federal agencies scoop up communications between Americans and foreign threats. Despite campaign pledges to rein in the NSA, say, Trump handed them the keys to the Fourth Amendment's back door, letting them conduct warrantless searches and call it national security. That foreign surveillance net just happened to catch millions of American emails and texts along the way. Oops. Then came the administration's most grotesque flex, family separation. In 2018, under the dystopian-sounding zero-tolerance policy, ICE agents tore children from their parents and scattered them across state lines without any tracking system. Infants and toddlers gone. The ACLU sued, the courts intervened, and yet hundreds, if not thousands, of children were never reunited because cruelty was the point. It was bureaucratized trauma disguised as immigration policy. Fast-track deportations bypassed hearings. People were expelled before they even saw a lawyer, and due process wasn't suspended, it was erased. While all that was happening, Trump rolled out a Muslim ban so blatantly discriminatory that federal courts initially blocked it. But after a couple of cosmetic edits, the Supreme Court gave it a thumbs up in 2018. So just like that, the government could legally discriminate as long as it came with a press release and some national security buzzwords. None of this was subtle. It was a stress test on the Constitution. And the truth is, we barely passed the test. Trump's first term didn't just reveal authoritarian instincts, it revealed how fragile our system really is. When the guardrails are treated as suggestions and consequences are delayed until it's too late. What's happening now in 2025 is not a surprise. It is the sequel we all should have expected. The script was written years ago, and the courts, Congress, and too many Americans let the curtain rise anyway. Part 3. How to sue your way to silence. Since January 20th, 2025, Trump's second term has escalated into a full-blown constitutional demolition derby, one where the First Amendment is the hood ornament and the dissenters are getting flattened. The last 90 days have been a grim speed run through the autocrat's favorite chapter of the playbook: crush protests, intimidate the press, and turn college campuses into ideological detention zones. On the streets, the crackdowns have been surgical and brutal. In 22 states, lawmakers have introduced over 40 anti-protest bills that read less like policy and more like Orwellian performance art. These laws carry felony penalties for blocking roads, fines for organizing protests deemed disruptive, and criminal liability for just showing up to the wrong rally. They weren't written to protect infrastructure, they were written to protect power. And if you're protesting pipelines, war crimes, or fascism in a bandana, then congratulations, you're probably a domestic threat. The goal is obvious: make the cost of protest so high that even holding a sign feels like playing Russian roulette with your civil rights. Back on campus, things have gotten downright dystopian. Executive Order 14188, sold to the public as an effort to fight anti-Semitism, has turned into a dragnet for punishing international students who dare to speak out, especially those waving a Palestinian flag or asking the wrong questions in class. Under the order, ICE is crawling campuses like it's hunting subversives in a McCarthy-era rerun, yanking visas and slapping deportation notices on students for alleged illegal protests. The message is crystal clear: criticize the state, lose your degree, your visa, and maybe even your future. Academic freedom is a buzzword for administration brochures. In 2025, free speech on campus has to pass a national security background check. It doesn't stop there. The White House has declared open war on the press with a level of vengeance that makes Nixon look like a community college civics teacher. In April, 60 Minutes executive producer Bill Owens resigned after Trump sued CBS for $20 billion over an interview with Kamala Harris. The segment apparently offended His Excellency. Owens was clear that he quit because, in his own view, he became the corporation's problem. Think about that. One of the most storied investigative news shows in American history was bent under the weight of a lawsuit designed not to win, but to exhaust, intimidate, and scare the next journalist into silence. Mission accomplished. And let's not forget about the $15 million settlement Trump wrung out of ABC News after George Stephanopoulos dared to speak out of turn about the E. Jean Carroll verdict. It wasn't just a payday, it was a message. Criticize me, and I will personally sue you into oblivion. These aren't lawsuits, they are guided missiles disguised as subpoenas. They are strategic lawsuits against public participation, slap lawsuits with the explicit goal of smothering critical coverage, and they're working. Legal threats, layoffs, and executive interference have turned once proud newsrooms into legal triage units. Every press pass now comes with a disclaimer: warning, use of this credential may result in financial obliteration. And if you think the administration is limiting its crusade to domestic outlets, think again. In March, Trump tried to gut got the US Agency for Global Media, home to Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, and others, because apparently America's international media presence wasn't sycophantic enough. Over 1,000 journalists were suspended overnight, and broadcasts that serve as lifelines in authoritarian states went dark, with budget cuts as the justification. The reality is that their full intent was to silence journalists, foreign and domestic, who don't toe the party line. It took a federal judge stepping in to block the move, calling it arbitrary, capricious, and likely illegal. And still, the damage was done. The US effectively handed over its global megaphone to state-sponsored propaganda outlets in China and Russia, all to preserve the president's fragile ego. Then there's academia, or at least what's left of it. Harvard, a bastion of bourgeois liberalism, found itself under siege for refusing to roll over and correct how it handles campus protests. The administration froze $2.2 billion in research grants, demanding that the university revamp its governance, hiring policies, and curriculum to better align with conservative orthodoxy. In response, Harvard sued. They argued that the Trump administration is using federal funds as a political bludgeon to suppress campus speech and academic freedom. And they're right. This is what weaponized governance looks like. Refuse to purge your diversity office? Lose your cancer research budget. It's not policy, it's extortion in a suit. But Harvard wasn't alone. 60 other universities received Department of Education warning letters, initiating investigations and threatening funding cuts unless they cracked down on student protests. Ostensibly, these were about combating anti-Semitism. In practice, they were about chilling speech, demonizing dissent, and turning universities into ideological echo chambers. The administration is using federal education funds the way mob bosses use baseball bats to make sure everyone's on message, or else. For a more detailed breakdown, see our video about Trump's war on higher learning. In less than 100 days, the Trump administration has taken a wrecking ball to the First Amendment. Protests are being criminalized, journalists are being sued into silence, and students are being deported for holding unpopular opinions. This is not about law and order. It is about power and obedience. It's about turning democratic rights into privileges you can lose the moment you speak out. And if you think they will stop at protesters, students, and journalists, just wait. They're coming for the rest of us too. Part 4. Your privacy has left the building. By the time Trump's second term hit the 90-day mark, it was already clear. The surveillance state wasn't just back, it had been handed steroids, satellite imagery, AI-powered drones, and a get-out-of-oversight free card signed by the president himself. In 2025, privacy is no longer an expectation. It is an inconvenience, and the Fourth Amendment is a quaint relic that is now being treated like a suggestion from a particularly naive intern at the NSA. It starts where it always does, with Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, a Cold War fossil repurposed as a limitless domestic dragnet. Despite bipartisan efforts in Congress to at least pretend there's a line between foreign surveillance and peeking into grandma's Gmail, the Trump administration has made it clear that it wants no reforms, no warrants, and no oversight. Senior officials have been deployed like loyal foot soldiers to stomp out any legislative rebellion, threatening vetoes for even the mildest suggestions that maybe, just maybe, Americans shouldn't be swept up in the intelligence community's fishing expeditions. A federal court recently ruled that querying U.S. persons without warrant may be unconstitutional, a ruling the White House responded to with the legal equivalent of a shrug and a thinly veiled yawn. They say it is the price of national security. You do not need privacy when you've got freedom, or rather, when the government has freedom from the Fourth Amendment, judicial review, and public scrutiny. But why stop at data scraping when you can watch people from space? In late March, the administration quietly instructed the intelligence agencies to begin using U.S. spy satellites to monitor border activity. We are now pointing billion-dollar orbital surveillance systems inward, not to track missiles, but migrants. Throw in a fleet of commercial drones, facial recognition, and a few proprietary AI models that mistake anything brown and breathing for a national security threat, and you've got yourself a digital wall. It's not metaphorical anymore. So who gets caught in the crosshairs of this racist perimeter? Everyone within a few miles of a border, plus a few million people who happen to live where proximity to civil unrest is now considered probable cause. This high-tech creep doesn't stop at the border either. Protests are now fertile ground for surveillance experiments that would make a Chinese technocrat blush. Cell tower data is being harvested like corn in Iowa. Geofence warrants, charming little judicial shortcuts that let cops collect information on every single phone in a protest zone, are now becoming routine. Want to peacefully demonstrate for climate action or Palestinian rights? Expect your phone's location to end up in a government spreadsheet, and expect the police to know your route home before you do. This isn't targeted surveillance, it's ideological profiling with a data plan. And if you're unlucky enough to be swept up in the dragnet, good luck proving your innocence in a system where your very presence in the crowd now makes you suspicious. If all this still sounds too subtle, don't worry. Trump also dusted off the Insurrection Act like it was a vintage MAGA hat. Inauguration Day 2025 came with a charming memorandum directing Defense and Homeland Security to assess whether military deployment within U.S. borders might be warranted. The administration openly flirted with using troops to bolster civilian law enforcement at the border, blurring the line between domestic policing and military occupation. The move set off alarms among civil liberties groups who pointed out correctly that using the U.S. military as a stand-in for police is a fast track to authoritarianism. The Posse Comitatus Act was supposed to prevent this exact nightmare scenario, but in Trump's America, legal tradition is just one more bureaucratic speed bump on the road to executive supremacy. And lest anyone think this was all a bureaucratic accident, the administration put its ambitions into writing. Executive Order 14161, signed on day one, gave DHS and the DoD sweeping authority to consolidate surveillance data across federal agencies, meaning that if you have ever interacted with a federal database like Medicaid, FAFSA, or even TSA PreCheck, you're now part of an integrated vetting machine. The language in the order insists it's all in the name of national security and public safety, but legal analysts warn this effectively creates a real-time surveillance architecture with no independent oversight. If fusion centers were already dystopian, this new system turns them into full-blown panopticons. But the piece de resistance came with Executive Order 14215, which brought supposedly independent agencies like the FCC and the FTC under direct White House supervision. In one stroke, the administration not only centralized regulatory authority, but positioned itself to gut privacy protections at will. Want to kill net neutrality again? Go ahead. Want to demand metadata retention from telecoms without court approval? Be our guest. With the executive branch now acting as judge, jury, and regulator-in-chief, there is no meaningful check on what data the government can collect or how it can be used. Put it all together, and what you've got isn't a security strategy. It's an authoritarian surveillance wish list come true. There is no more illusion of restraint or pretense of balance. Americans are being watched, tracked, analyzed, and categorized by a government that sees dissent as disloyalty and privacy as a loophole to be closed. The goal is not safety, it is submission. And under Trump's second term, your freedom has been rerouted through a facial recognition checkpoint, and the Fourth Amendment has been redacted into oblivion. Part 5. Due process is dead. In 2025, the Trump administration is proving that when it comes to the Bill of Rights, the Fifth Amendment is just another inconvenient speed bump on the road to authoritarian convenience. Due process, equal protection, and fair elections have been systematically reimagined as optional luxuries for the undeserving, rather than rights for the governed. At the heart of this constitutional demolition derby are mass deportations without hearings, ICE raids that look more like wartime roundups, and a voting strategy that would make Jim Crow blush. Let's start with immigration. In a stunt that would make John Adams spin in his powdered wig, Trump's DOJ exhumed the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to fast-track deportations without giving people so much as a chance to speak to a lawyer or breathe near a court. Originally designed for wartime France, this statute has now been rebranded as a 21st century sledgehammer for kicking out brown people without due process. Legal scholars and civil rights advocates immediately screamed bloody murder, because that's what this is. Bypassing hearings under the flimsiest national security pretext isn't just cruel, it's an executive tantrum in lawfare cosplay. These are not just hypotheticals. ICE, freshly emboldened by the second Trump coronation, launched a new wave of enforcement operations so sweeping it looks less like law enforcement and more like a medieval manhunt. Visa revocations, pre-dawn raids, and mass detentions have become a grotesque routine. Advocacy groups report immigrants, even legal ones, being yanked into custody without access to counsel, packed into expanded detention centers like cattle for deportation before the ink on their paperwork even dries. These aren't just bureaucratic snafus, they're systemic erasures of due process, where whole communities are ghosted by the state with the legal grace of a banana republic. The courts, already wheezing under the weight of executive contempt, are not having it, or at least not entirely. In April, U.S. District Judge Paula Zinnes threatened contempt proceedings over the administration's blatant refusal to return Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a deportee unlawfully removed removed despite court injunctions. Judge James Boasberg found probable cause for criminal contempt in similar deportation fiascos. The Supreme Court, in a rare flash of spine, even issued temporary blocks on certain removals, insisting that people must be given reasonable time to challenge their deportations, with reasonable time, of course, being a radical concept in a government that sees court orders as suggestions and courtrooms as nuisances. All of this would be bad enough if the attacks stopped at the border, but Trump's anti-democratic jihad extends right into the ballot box. In March, he signed Executive Order 14160, a fever dream of voter suppression so brazen it makes Bush v. Gore look like a friendly game of Monopoly. The order directs the Election Assistance Commission to require documentary proof of citizenship for voter registration and threatens to withhold federal election funds from states that don't comply. Passports or birth certificates, or you don't vote. End of discussion. The goal is clear. Purge the rolls of the poor, the young, the elderly, and the brown. It is not a policy. It is an eviction notice from democracy. Don't count on the Justice Department stepping in anytime soon. Under Trump's watch, DOJ officials have dropped voting rights cases like hot coals. They've abandoned challenges to Georgia's racist voting laws and walked away from Hazleton, Pennsylvania, where Hispanic voters were being structurally disenfranchised. The official rationale was that the suppression claims were unfounded since there was increased voter turnout. The real reason was a complete reprogramming of civil rights enforcements to ensure the government looks the other way as states suppress the vote under the guise of election security. The Supreme Court, not wanting to feel left out, joined the sabotage parade by reinstating Virginia's voter roll purge in October 2024, just weeks before the election. More than 1,600 people were removed based on dodgy data flagging them as non-citizens. Many of them were naturalized citizens or simply had DMV records that didn't match. No hearings, no fact-checking, they were just erased. When challenged, the court offered no full opinion, just a curt emergency order and a smirk. Welcome to judicial efficiency. Suppress first, explain never. Trump and his acolytes have gone on an endless tirade against mail-in voting, calling it fraudulent despite zero evidence and a whole universe of facts that say otherwise. Executive Order 14160 doesn't just invent a citizenship requirement, it instructs the DOJ to go after states that count ballots received after Election Day. Never mind that many military and overseas ballots rely on such timelines, or that counting all the votes used to be considered patriotic. In this administration, if you don't vote fast enough or in person, you're suspicious by default. And as if all this weren't Orwellian enough, the administration has begun using federal funding like a mafia protection racket. Comply with voter ID laws, adopt proof of citizenship, and maybe your state gets its election money. If you refuse, enjoy being publicly accused of harboring fraud. The White House has even floated using non-election funds like housing, education, and disaster relief as backdoor pressure points to force states into compliance. It's coercion in a suit and tie, with the veneer of policy but the soul of authoritarianism. So here we are, the Fifth Amendment gutted, the vote under siege, and the federal government more interested in purging democracy than protecting it. Trump's second term isn't just a sequel, it's a reboot of rights erosion as national policy. And unless the courts, the people, and Congress fight back hard and fast, we may not just be witnessing voter suppression. We might be watching the slow, deliberate strangling of constitutional democracy. Part 6. Democracy's Exit Exam. The first 90 days of Trump's second term have been a constitutional crime scene. Executive orders drop like drone strikes. Civil rights are stripped with the elegance of a smash-and-grab robbery. The administration has declared war on the First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments, and the body count is already piling up. This is not just governance. It is the deliberate demolition of democracy by a man who believes the Constitution is something you wipe your shoes on before entering a golden elevator. We are now governed by executive fiat, enforced by ICE raids, and carried out by cabinet secretaries with resumes lifted from Heritage Foundation fever dreams. The Alien Enemies Act, dug up from the crypt like a Lovecraftian horror show, is now used to expel immigrants with all the due process of a trapdoor. Peaceful protests are labeled terrorism. Voting is treated as a criminal enterprise. Surveillance is normalized. And when courts issue injunctions, the response from the Oval Office isn't compliance, it is contempt. Yes, there have been pushbacks. Judges in Denver and DC have stepped in, slapping temporary duct tape over the administration administration's unconstitutional gaping wounds. Civil liberties lawyers are working overtime, filing suits faster than the administration can invent new ways to trample the Bill of Rights. And Congress has even managed to muster a few press releases and the occasional strongly worded letter. But let's not kid ourselves. The pace and scale of executive defiance, open, repeated, and proud, represent a constitutional crisis in slow motion, and the longer it is tolerated, the faster that crisis metastasizes into the new normal. We have watched the Justice Department abandon Voting Rights Act enforcement like it was a bad Tinder date. We have watched the White House strong-arm the Election Assistance Commission into turning voter registration into a paperwork obstacle course, and we have seen court orders defied, press access revoked, academic freedom extinguished with budget freezes, and protesters tracked by spy satellites. Every warning we ignored in 2016 is now public policy. Every "that could never happen here" is happening now. But resistance is not extinct. Civil rights groups, legal watchdogs, independent journalists, and ordinary people are still in this fight. Lawsuits are moving through the courts. Investigative reporters are still exposing the rot, and congressional allies are still introducing bills, some symbolic, others substantial, none with a snowball's chance in hell of passing under this administration. Former national security officials are filing amicus briefs warning that the rule of law isn't just an abstraction. It is the only thing standing between a republic and a regime. The institutions are strained, but not yet broken. The people are tired, but not yet silenced. So what can you do in the face of this authoritarian fever dream? Stay informed. The media is under siege for a reason. Information is power. Read everything. Subscribe to outlets that haven't been sued into oblivion. Call your representatives, then call them again. Flood their inboxes. Light up their switchboards. Let them know you see what's happening and that you will not forget. Give what you can to organizations on the front lines like the ACLU, NAACP, Democracy Forward, and others who are doing the legal trench warfare the rest of us can't. Vote like your rights depend on it, because they do. Organize, protest, run for office, knock on doors, talk to your neighbors, register people to vote, and challenge disinformation with truth even when it's hard, even when it's exhausting. Support independent journalists and whistleblowers. They are risking everything to tell you the truth before truth becomes contraband. And most of all, do not normalize this. Do not let exhaustion turn into acceptance, and do not let the slow bleed of civil liberties make you numb, because that is how authoritarianism wins. Not with a bang, but with 1,000 sighs of resignation. This is not just politics. This is history, and it is writing itself in real time. Your kids and grandkids will not ask how bad things were. They will ask what you did when it got this bad. So act like democracy is on fire, because it is. Hi, I'm Tessa with Brain Rot News, here with a few bits of medical malpractice from our so-called government for you to choke on. Part 1. The rights misadventures in undermining your health. Let's talk about healthcare, or at least what's left of it after being run over by the Trump administration like it was a possum crossing a 6-lane highway. If you believe healthcare is a human right, congratulations, you are a decent person. You believe that whether you are a janitor, a billionaire, or just some guy who eats string cheese with a knife and fork, you still deserve to see a doctor without signing away your firstborn child and a kidney. That vision, of course, stands in direct opposition to the worldview currently pissing on the White House lawn. Trump's second term has doubled down on the Republican notion that healthcare should be a brutal game of survival of the richest, with a healthy dose of social Darwinism. Their philosophy is simple. If you can't afford insulin, maybe you were never meant to survive in God's free market. This is not just a few bad policy tweaks. This is an ideological war, a full-scale siege on the very idea that the government should help people stay alive if there isn't a profit in it. Every decision, every budget cut, every bureaucratic sabotage has been crafted with one goal in mind: shrink public health protections down until they fit in the glove compartment of a luxury SUV owned by a United Healthcare CEO. And remember, America's healthcare system wasn't exactly winning gold medals to begin with. Compared to other developed nations, we already boast the highest costs, the worst outcomes, and the most GoFundMe accounts masquerading as insurance policies. Now, under the new reign of deregulation and corporate love letters, these cracks in the system are splitting wide open, and it's the poor, the sick, and the marginalized who are being shoved into them headfirst. Every time this administration throws out phrases like efficiency and cost savings. What they really mean is we are about to cut a life support line and call it fiscal responsibility. Behind every buzzword about freedom and innovation is a human being rationing their life-saving medication or bleeding out in an ER that just closed for cost savings. So if you were wondering whether healthcare was safe from the same wrecking ball they've been swinging at voting rights, education, and basic human dignity, sorry, it's already halfway to the grave, and the people holding the shovels are lobbyists. Let's get started. Part 2. RFK Jr. is beating public health to death with a rusty shovel. If you have ever wondered what would happen if you handed the keys to the nation's health infrastructure to a conspiracy theorist who thinks science is a deep state psyop, wonder no more. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., freshly installed as Secretary of Health and Human Services as of March 12, 2025, has wasted absolutely no time lighting the building on fire and locking the doors from the inside. One of his first big moves was blowing up the Department of Health and Human Services and duct taping its charred remains into something called the Administration for a Healthy America, a name that sounds suspiciously like it was ripped from the rejected slogans pile of a 1950s anti-fluoridation campaign, or I guess a 2025 anti-fluoridation campaign in this case. Under this masterstroke of rebranding, critical agencies like the CDC and NIH are being gutted, with deep budget cuts and layoffs, slashing through the nation's already fragile disease tracking, pandemic preparedness, and basic public health infrastructure like a bad horror movie villain who just discovered power tools. Critics, and by critics we mean anyone who has ever passed a high school biology class, or hell, even just sat in on one, they are sounding every alarm that this is not reform. It is sabotage. Slashing disease surveillance and research funding after a global pandemic is a bit like removing the smoke detectors from your house because you already had one fire and survived. It doesn't stop there. RFK Jr. has taken a jackhammer to the scientific research community too, proposing a cap on indirect cost rates for NIH grants, a move that would financially kneecap every research lab that isn't already funded by Elon Musk's pocket change. Labs are already shuttering and promising research is grinding to a halt. In RFK Jr.'s America, if your study isn't about miracle supplements, horse paste, or how kale is secretly microchipping you, you're out of luck. Research areas like diversity, equity and inclusion, LGBTQ health, and vaccine hesitancy are being starved to death on purpose, because apparently public health is when you pretend marginalized people and basic immunology does not exist. And then came the autism comments, because of course they did. After the CDC reported new autism prevalence numbers, RFK Jr. took this opportunity to demonstrate that his grasp of neurodevelopmental science is about on par with a YouTube comment section. He described autism in terms so insulting, so medically inaccurate, that autism advocacy groups practically crashed the internet rushing to respond. Apparently, in his America, autistic individuals are incapable of paying taxes, holding jobs, or forming relationships. A cruel, dehumanizing lie disproven by thousands of autistic adults living full, independent lives, like the writers, editor, and host of this show, for example. But RFK Jr. wasn't done embarrassing himself and endangering public health. No, he doubled down on his favorite greatest hit, blaming vaccines for autism. Despite the mountains of evidence debunking that claim so thoroughly, it might as well be buried under a Costco's worth of scientific consensus. He's now demanding massive new studies to find environmental causes of what he calls the autism epidemic, setting an absurd September deadline to solve autism like it's a crossword puzzle, all while stacking key public health initiatives with anti-vax cranks, conspiracy theorists, and anyone who seems genuinely confused about how vaccines work. This is not just fringe science creeping into public policy, it's turning public health into a cult meeting with a government budget. RFK Jr.'s reign at HHS isn't just an embarrassing sideshow, it is a direct, targeted assault on science, on medical progress, and on every vulnerable community that actually depends on a functioning, reality-based public health system to survive. And if you think the consequences will be limited to conspiracy theorists at freedom rallies with anti-mask bumper stickers, think again. This hits hospitals, universities, children's health, vaccine supply chains, and anyone who's ever had so much as a bad flu. This is not a drill. It is the slow, intentional demolition of evidence-based medicine, and the collateral damage is all of us. Part 3. Legislative and executive sabotage. If you are still clinging to the fantasy that healthcare is a right in America, the Trump administration is here to personally rip that illusion from your cold, uninsured hands. Since day one of his second term, Trump and his band of ideological arsonists have been lighting fire to the Affordable Care Act like it's a witch in Salem, rolling back every executive order that even dared to whisper about making healthcare accessible or affordable. By reversing expanded enrollment periods or slashing funding for outreach programs enacted by the previous administration, they effectively took a wrecking ball to the very infrastructure meant to get Americans insured. The result is predictable. Fewer people signing up, more uninsured families, and a healthcare system that's increasingly only for those rich enough to never really need it. And if you're part of a marginalized group, congratulations. You are their favorite punching bag. Trump's flurry of executive orders reads like a dystopian manifesto. Executive Order 14187, charmingly titled Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation, and Executive Order 14168, Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism, are not about protecting anyone. They are about legislating cruelty, banning gender-affirming care, and forcing an extremist vision of gender onto every American who does not fit neatly into the 1950s stereotypes. It is not policy. It is state-sponsored bigotry in a suit and tie. Now, reproductive rights are being gutted with gleeful efficiency by rescinding protections for reproductive health care services. The administration has all but announced that women and people who can get pregnant are second-class citizens whose autonomy can be legislated away with a few strokes of a pen. And just to make sure no one escapes unscathed, they are planning to let the ACA premium tax credits expire, skyrocketing insurance costs and pushing millions back into the ranks of the uninsured. The Trump administration isn't just incompetent, it's hostile. Every order is a love letter to the idea that if you cannot afford healthcare, you do not deserve it. Of course, bypassing Congress through executive orders means they get to bulldoze democracy while they're at it. No messy debates, no pesky hearings, just pure, undiluted authoritarian policy making, signed, sealed, and delivered straight to the most vulnerable among us. But even this blitzkrieg of cruelty isn't going unchallenged. Lawsuits are piling up as civil rights groups fight back, pointing out that many of these decrees are not only morally bankrupt, but legally flimsy enough to crumble under real scrutiny. At its core, this entire strategy is a war on marginalized communities. The targets, including trans and gender nonconforming people, low-income families, immigrants, and people of color, are chosen with surgical precision. It is not just about reforming healthcare. It is about reinforcing a caste system where basic human dignity, let alone basic medical care, is a luxury item. They are doing this out in the open with no shame, no apology, and no camouflage. This is not healthcare policy. It is ideological warfare dressed up as governance, and unless it's stopped, the human cost will be measured in lost lives, not just lost coverage. Part 4. Budgetary Strangulation. If you thought the Trump administration's plan to wreck healthcare stopped at banning gender-affirming care and sabotaging insurance access, think again. They've also set their sights on smashing the very infrastructure that makes public health even remotely functional, and they're doing it with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball strapped to a monster truck. The latest federal budget proposal doesn't just trim funding for the Department of Health and Human Services, it kneecaps it, proposing to hack away a third of its funding like a maniac with a rusty hatchet. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is slated for a 44% budget cut, because apparently we learned nothing from the pandemic. The National Institutes of Health are up for a 40% reduction, because why waste money on silly little things like cancer research or new antibiotics when you could reroute it to tax breaks for billionaires? And it does not stop with just the big names. Entire lifelines are being set on fire. Head Start, HIV and AIDS initiatives, the Health Resources and Services Administration, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and the Administration for Community Living are all on the chopping block. If you need mental health care, HIV prevention, elder services, early childhood support, or pretty much anything that doesn't involve rich people getting richer, you're out of luck. This isn't fiscal responsibility, it's social arson. Just to pour some extra gasoline on the fire, the administration has decided that those billions of dollars allocated to fight COVID-19 needs to be clawed back from state and local health departments too. Infectious disease tracking, vaccination programs, public health infrastructure. Hope you like crossing your fingers and hoping for the best, because because that's your new pandemic plan. But maybe, if you squint hard enough, you'll see a glimmer of strategy. They are not just cutting budgets randomly. They are deliberately making sure that when the next health crisis hits, the government will be powerless to respond, and corporations will be there to pick the bones clean. Short-term savings, long-term death tolls. It's austerity for the masses and blank checks for private industry, all under the laughably transparent excuse of fiscal responsibility. Let's not forget the dark comedy of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. standing in front of the American people and declaring he wants to end America's epidemic of chronic illness, while simultaneously greenlighting the annihilation of chronic disease prevention programs. That's like promising to cure hunger by closing every grocery store and setting fire to the farms. It would almost be funny if it weren't going to kill people. Buried inside all these cuts and chaos is the shiny new Administration for a Healthy America, a cute little rebranding exercise that consolidates gutted departments into a single bureaucratic monolith. In theory, streamlining sounds efficient. In practice, it is about stripping away expertise, centralizing decision-making into political hands, and turning the nation's health department into a tool for ideological enforcement. Who needs independent scientists when you can have loyal apparatchiks rubber stamping whatever madness RFK and Trump cook up next? This is not policy reform. It is a systemic wrecking ball, a cold, calculated plan to starve public health until it collapses, making healthcare something you buy at auction if you're lucky enough to survive long enough to bid. And if we do not stop it, the next time a crisis comes, there will not be a public health system left to respond. There will only be the scavengers waiting to profit from it. Part 5. Reallocating funds and undermining science. If you were hoping science might survive the Trump administration's second term, bad news. They're not just gutting public health, they are trying to break the very machinery of scientific research itself, and then sell the scraps to the highest bidder. It starts with what they're calling a 15% cap on indirect costs for NIH grants. And if that sounds boring, trust me, it is not. It's a bomb disguised as budgetary policy. These indirect costs keep the lights on in research labs, pay the people who sterilize equipment, maintain data security, and make sure that actual human scientists can spend their time curing cancer instead of fixing the plumbing themselves. Slash those funds, and suddenly universities and hospitals aren't research hubs anymore. They are empty buildings with a few sad grad students left holding the pipettes. Temporary court rulings have blocked this cap for now, but the administration is hell-bent on starving science at the source, making sure the next generation of breakthroughs dies in the lab before it ever reaches a patient. It gets worse. They're not just choking off resources, they are hand-picking who gets to do science at all. Grants focused on diversity, equity and inclusion, LGBTQ health, and vaccine hesitancy are gone. If your research questions the administration's narrative, if it suggests that marginalized people deserve care, if it so much as implies that vaccines are good, you can kiss your funding goodbye. It is not science. It's a political loyalty test masquerading as grant reviews. This is censorship with a budget line, a slow purge of inconvenient facts dressed up as policy realignment. Instead, they're throwing money at their pet project, the Make America Healthy Again Commission, a new initiative to study the root causes of chronic illness, particularly in children. Sounds sorta harmless until you realize that in Trump world, root causes probably involve blaming everything on vaccines, windmills, soy milk, or insufficient Christian prayer. This is not about advancing public health. It's about laundering conspiracy theories into something that looks like legitimate science, while starving real research until it collapses under the weight of bureaucratic sabotage. If you thought the pharmaceutical industry might finally get reined in, think again. Despite all the populist bluster and bullshit about cutting drug prices, the administration's real actions, including deregulation, weakening price controls, and stacking the FDA with industry cronies, suggest they are more interested in helping Big Pharma price gouge patients into oblivion rather than saving anyone a dime. It's almost impressive. They have managed to both gut scientific research and make it harder and more expensive to access whatever medical innovations somehow survive the purge. At its core, this is not incompetence. It is the deliberate weaponization of healthcare and science as tools of ideological control. Research that uplifts marginalized communities will be erased. Programs that promote equity will be defunded. And science that might embarrass the administration or contradict the cult narrative will be silenced. What we are watching isn't just a budget fight. It's the systematic dismantling of evidence-based policy in favor of a reality handpicked by grifters, ideologues, and profiteers. If we let them get away with this, the damage will not just be measured in dollars lost. It will be measured in preventable deaths, abandoned cures, shattered communities, and a future where the truth itself is just another casualty of power. Part 6. deregulating us to death. The Trump administration's healthcare reforms are what happens when you let libertarian fever dreams and big pharma lobbyists co-author public policy. Under the buzzword of deregulation, they are not freeing patients. They are dismantling every basic safeguard that keeps healthcare from turning into the Hunger Games for the sick and dying. Let's touch on Trump's idea of price transparency. Trump's people love to frame this as a bold, populist move forcing hospitals and insurers to post prices for procedures and treatments so consumers can shop around for their cancer surgery like it's a Black Friday deal on flat screen TVs. And that all sounds great until you realize that most people do not get to comparison shop while having a stroke, and even if they could, the listings are deliberately opaque, inconsistent, and often useless without an insurance decoder ring and a background in forensic accounting. Plus, the administration has done next to nothing to enforce the transparency rules they so loudly tout. It's the healthcare equivalent of putting a sale sign on a burning building and calling it consumer protection. Meanwhile, in the prescription drug market, where Americans already pay more than anyone else on the planet, Trump's crew has been busy pushing for deregulation under the guise of access. They flirt with ideas like drug importation without seriously addressing safety standards. They gut regulations on telehealth prescribing, and they posture about insulin and EpiPen affordability while doing jack all to actually lower the prices in ways that matter. Their real energy, of course, is spent trying to dismantle Medicare drug price negotiation, the one mechanism that could force Big Pharma to stop treating basic medicine like a luxury yacht timeshare. Let's not forget, while pretending to champion the little guy, the administration is quietly making it easier for pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers to flood the market with products under weaker safety standards. Human subject protections are being watered down. Clinical trial reporting requirements are being relaxed, and oversight of experimental treatments are being shunted aside for the sake of innovation, which here reads as profit without accountability. Tying the whole rotten package together is the Make America Healthy Again Commission, a politically weaponized group whose real mission isn't improving public health, it's dictating which science gets funded based on political loyalty rather than medical necessity. In their world, research into autism caused by vaccines, a conspiracy theory so dead it's decomposing, gets prioritized, while studies on racial health disparities, gender-affirming care, or the real causes of chronic illness get defunded or shoved into bureaucratic oblivion. All of it, every half-assed price transparency rule, every deregulatory reform, every gutting of research oversight points to one brutal reality. This administration does not believe in healthcare as a public good. They believe in healthcare as a commodity, one that only the wealthy deserve to access safely and affordably. If you're poor, marginalized, sick, or just unlucky, good luck out there. Hope you remembered to comparison shop for that ambulance ride. What Trump's people call cutting red tape is really about cutting you from the protections, rights, and services that once stood between you and medical bankruptcy, suffering, or death. And they are doing it gleefully, openly, betting that enough people are too exhausted, too scared, too sick, or too confused to stop them. But we are not confused. We see exactly what they are doing, and no amount of slick press conferences or patriotic branding will hide the blood on their hands. Part 7. Medicine versus Malice. While the Trump administration continues to treat healthcare like a hedge fund liquidation sale, an army of doctors, nurses, researchers, and patient advocates have been fighting like hell to hold the line. Across the healthcare world, the response has been loud, furious, and unified. This is not just bad policy, it's malpractice at a national scale. Organizations like the American Medical Association and the American Hospital Association haven't minced words. They've blasted Trump's healthcare agenda for gutting Medicare physician payments, jamming even more bureaucratic red tape into an already broken system through bloated prior authorization requirements, and greenlighting dangerous expansions of medical practice to non-physician providers without proper oversight, all under the paper-thin excuse of efficiency. Because efficient healthcare is when you have a sleep-deprived urgent care tech diagnose your heart attack on a Zoom call. Public health groups like the American Public Health Association and grassroots initiatives like For Our Health have been equally savage. They are warning that the administration's budget hacks will shred the nation's already fraying public health safety net, leaving us hilariously underprepared for the next pandemic, climate disaster, or basic flu season. Apparently, the plan is to just cruise through the next health crisis with good vibes and ivermectin. Patient advocacy groups from disability rights coalitions to LGBTQ health advocates have made it crystal clear. The Trump administration's policies will hit marginalized communities the hardest, from rolling back Medicaid expansion and blocking gender-affirming care to restricting reproductive health. It's a greatest hits album of cruelty that disproportionately disproportionately screws over the sick, the poor, the disabled, and the politically inconvenient. In other words, if you're not rich, cis, straight, and healthy, you are expendable. Researchers and academics are openly sounding the alarm about the administration's war on science itself. Slashing funding for life-saving research, politicizing grant decisions, and installing ideologues to oversee scientific agencies aren't just bad ideas. They are the blueprint for a slow-motion societal collapse. And when the next preventable disease outbreak happens because your local health department got defunded and replaced with a Make America Healthy Again pop-up tent, you'll know exactly who to thank. The resistance isn't just symbolic. It's lawsuits, court challenges, public campaigns, professional strikes, and blistering open letters signed by thousands of medical experts demanding that the government stop treating healthcare like an afterthought and start treating it like the basic human right it is. Across every corner of the healthcare ecosystem, the message is clear. The Trump administration's policies are not just misguided, they're a direct, reckless, and systemic assault on public health itself. The only question now is whether the rest of us are willing to fight back hard enough, fast enough, and fiercely enough to stop the damage before it becomes irreversible. Part 8. Reclaim healthcare before they burn it to the ground. What you have just heard is not a random assortment of bad decisions. It is a deliberate, scorched earth campaign against the very idea that healthcare should be a human right in America. It is not incompetence, it is sabotage. And if it's allowed to continue, it will leave a healthcare system so gutted, so hollowed out, that future generations will talk about good healthcare the way we talk about rotary phones, as something quaint and long dead. The Trump administration has not just targeted the Affordable Care Act, it's gone after every safeguard designed to make sure basic human survival is not reserved for the rich. They have dismantled reproductive rights. They have criminalized gender-affirming care. And they have plotted to let the ACA subsidies expire, turning insurance premiums into luxury items. And they have slashed budgets for the CDC and NIH mid-measles outbreak, because what better time to defund disease research than right after we see a preventable deadly disease make a comeback? They have politicized science itself, cutting off grants that do not fit their ideological purity tests. They have muzzled public health institutions, turned research funding into loyalty oaths, and shoved critical healthcare decisions further into the hands of profiteers and grifters. Every move, every budget slash, every executive order has sent one message loud and clear. If you're poor, sick, disabled, queer, a person of color, or just unlucky enough to need medical care, you are disposable. Despite all this carnage, the resistance is real. Healthcare workers, patient advocates, public health experts, and everyday people have stood up and screamed, enough. They have filed lawsuits. They have mobilized communities. They have marched, organized, and demanded better. And they are reminding the world that healthcare is not a favor you beg for. It is a right you fight for. Here's what we can do. Raise hell, write, protest, organize, sabotage their narrative at every turn. Vote like the whole goddamn health system is teetering on the edge, because it is. Support unions, build coalitions, drag these policies into the daylight and name them for what they are. A death sentence for the poor, the marginalized, and the disabled. And when they tell you it's about medical freedom, spit the truth back in their faces. Freedom without healthcare is just a slow death you cannot afford to treat. Healthcare is a human right. It always has been, and it always will be. But rights do not defend themselves. People do. And if we do not fight like hell right now, they are going to take everything that's left. Hi, I'm Tessa with Brain Rot News, here with a few bits of algorithmically optimized bits of information for you to choke on. Today, we'll be tackling the many ways in which the internet has become an intolerable, unusable wasteland. Part 1. Defining the digital battlefield. Online influence campaigns are exactly what they sound like. Coordinated digital clusterfucks designed to sell you a mattress, convince you democracy is fake, or occasionally start a coup, all without ever leaving the comfort of a Wi-Fi signal. Imagine armies of accounts, some run by bored 20-somethings in marketing cubicles, and others by shadowy intelligence operatives or paid trolls, coordinating to steer your thoughts, stoke your fears, and reshape your beliefs without you ever realizing the water's been poisoned. One day, you'll see a factual statistic about unemployment plucked from a single county and then extrapolated as if it's a nationwide catastrophe. The next, you'll be deluged with pixel-perfect memes about how your next-door neighbor is secretly controlling the government. It's not always outright falsehoods. The real genius of these campaigns is that they don't need to fabricate entire scandals. They can take the tiniest sliver of truth, couch it in emotional triggers, and let your own biases fill in the rest of the story. At their core, influence operations thrive on inauthenticity. You'll encounter grassroots pages with thousands of likes, banks that were built in a weekend by a handful of paid interns. You will see concerned citizens posting heartfelt testimonies that were ghostwritten by PR firms. And you'll hear urgent news channels that exist only to recycle sensationalist headlines. But behind the scenes, platforms measure every click, every pause, every time your scroll finger hesitates over a post. They sell that data to anyone with a few $1,000s to spend. From campaign managers and corporate interests, all the way to foreign governments, all of them eager to turn your attention into a weapon. And once they have that weapon locked and loaded, there is no safe zone. There is no quiet scroll. Every swipe, tap, or share is a potential recruitment into their digital army, a momentary surrender of your autonomy. This is the new front line. Gone are the days when propaganda required giant posters and primetime TV slots. Now, you can wage a global manipulation campaign from a dingy cubicle in Mumbai or a government office in Moscow, all paid for with laundered money and carried out with off-the-shelf software. The result is a fractured public square where every voice seems suspicious, every fact seems negotiable, and the only certainty is that someone else is pulling the strings, and they are having a hell of a time watching you argue with your uncle about UFO landings. Welcome to the digital battlefield in today's war for hearts, minds, and the last shreds of shared reality. Part 2. The goals and motivations behind influence operations. Influence operations are the pinnacle of low-risk, high-reward warfare, where the currency is not money or territory, but your belief in basic facts and your willingness to share outrage. For political actors, whether elected officials, backroom power brokers, or clandestine foreign agencies, the payoff is immense. Why bother crafting coherent policy proposals when you can simply erode trust in the entire electoral process? A well-timed smear campaign can suppress turnout in key districts or ignite infinite culture war flashpoints that distract voters from real issues, all without firing a single shot. For corporations, influence operations have become a growth hack on steroids. If traditional advertising has become stale and people are tired of polished commercials, why not masquerade your marketing as genuine social movements? A sneaker brand creates a youth empowerment page and then quietly buys engagement to push a line of $200 shoes. Or a fast food chain plants undercover food critics praising limited-time menu items, then watches as their social feeds explode with user-generated praise, because nothing sells better than the perception of authentic buzz, and nothing is more authentic than a flood of accounts that look and sound like regular people. But the data harvested from every interaction, your likes, your comments, your watch time, gets packaged and sold to the highest bidder, perpetuating a cycle where attention is the ultimate commodity. Then there are the fringe profiteers, the conspiracy merchants, the so-called alternative influencers, who trade exclusively in fear and resentment. They do not care about votes or sneakers. They care about clicks and subscriptions. To them, your anxiety is a subscription model, your outrage is ad revenue, and your despair is a steady cash flow. They'll latch onto any grievance, like racial tension, economic insecurity, or gender politics, and amplify it to a fever pitch, keeping you on edge so you never stray far from their channel. It's the ultimate gig economy. Hustle, monetize other people's pain, and keep them angry enough to never notice the algorithm is the real puppet master. At the end of the day, influence campaigns are about one thing: control. Control of narratives, control of identities, and most crucially, control of behavior. By shaping the stories you see, they shape how you act, how you vote, what you buy, and even how you relate to your neighbors. And the relative anonymity of the digital realm means they can sow chaos and then slip away, leaving a burned out populace scrambling for answers that will never come. No wonder these tactics are so popular. They're cheap, they work, and they leave almost no paper trail. It's the perfect crime for the attention economy. Part 3. Who's pulling the strings? The puppeteer roster behind online influence campaigns is diverse, stretching from the marble halls of authoritarian regimes to the polished offices of Fortune 500 marketing firms, and everywhere in between. On the nation-state side, Russia's Internet Research Agency set the gold standard for troll farm chaos, flooding US social media with everything from fake patriot pages to grassroots-style agitprop. China's 50-cent army brings home the silver, employing tens of thousands of paid protesters to defend government policy and drown out dissent. dissent. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and even smaller autocracies have joined the fray, each adapting the playbook to local context and exporting lessons to global platforms. Closer to home, domestic political machines and their dark money masters have learned to weaponize the same tactics. Super PACs and shadowy nonprofit fronts pour untold millions into digital ads that masquerade as issue-based outreach. Under the pretense of public service, they run micro-targeted smear campaigns, voter suppression pushes, or culture war stunts in the communities that matter most. When an ad appears in your feed that perfectly aligns with your demographic profile down to your zip code, your income bracket, and your Netflix watch history, it probably feels like the company is speaking directly to you. And those ads often fall outside of the scope of traditional campaign finance regulations, making accountability almost impossible. Next up, the corporate marketing conglomerates. Ad agencies that one minute are selling you organic oatmeal and the next are ghostwriting political rhetoric for billionaire candidates. They pitch full-stack engagement services, including social listening, influencer seeding, bot amplification, and crisis management, all under one roof. A single team might launch a pro-entrepreneurship grassroots movement one day and leak a scandalous rumor about a rival firm the next. Rounding out the cast are the freelancers and fringe operators, conspiracy theory merchants on YouTube, Telegram channel shearers of human rage, and commercial trolls selling their services on dark web forums. They do not answer to governments or corporations. They answer only to profit margins and engagement metrics. For them, discrediting democracy or promoting snake oil supplements are just two sides of the same coin. If you can monetize anger and confusion, that's a business worth scaling. Every time you click, share, or comment, you validate the algorithmic signals they rely on. Your outrage becomes the feedback loop that trains the system. In this ecosystem, complicity is automated. You help amplify the very content that's poisoning your outlook on the world, all without leaving your couch. It's a deeply cynical arrangement, but it's the one we find ourselves in. A tangled web of state actors, private firms, and freelance propagandists, all collaborating in a massive, decentralized experiment in mass psychology. And the scariest part is that most of us do not even recognize that we are a part of this experiment. Part 4. The evolution of digital influence. Long before TikTok dance challenges and viral cat videos, the internet was a scrappy underground scene where activists emailed each other from dusty dorm rooms, and bulletin board systems crackled with secret manifestos. Back in the early 90s, a ragtag coalition of privacy advocates and amateur hackers galvanized around Lotus Marketplace, a doomed IBM project that threatened to compile personal data on millions of Americans. Their weapons of choice were mass emails and frantic bulletin board posts that branded the project Big Brother on crack, ultimately persuading IBM to bury the whole thing. It was low-tech guerrilla warfare, but it worked. The lesson was to mobilize people online, turn their outrage into real-world pressure, and watch corporate leviathans scurry for cover. By 1996, the first presidential campaign websites sprouted like weeds in newly germinated digital soil. Bill Clinton and Bob Dole each set up basic pages where you could read policy blurbs if you were patient enough to wait through 5-minute dial-up downloads. Donations via the web were a novelty, but the potential was obvious. What if you could target messages to supporters' inboxes instead of town hall meetings? A few years later, Howard Dean's 2004 presidential bid would seize on meetup.com to organize volunteers by the thousands, foreshadowing an age when fervent supporters weren't just mailing postcards, they were streaming live video from campaign rallies. Then came Facebook's fateful leap to the general public in 2006, followed soon after by Twitter's 140-character shouting platform. Suddenly, anyone with a cell phone could broadcast to millions, and everyone did. Early adopters marveled at the democratization of media, but journalists didn't have the luxury of bypassing verification protocols. And suddenly, news feeds were stuffed with hot takes, rumor mills, and hyper-targeted ads. Barack Obama's 2008 campaign leveraged these tools with surgical precision by micro-targeting fundraising appeals by demographic, releasing viral videos by issue, and utilizing a data-driven volunteer army that revolutionized modern campaigning. It was a preview of what was to come, a fully industrialized, algorithm-driven engine for shaping public sentiment. By 2014, the Kremlin's propagandists had taken note. Russia unleashed its troll farms on Ukraine's maiden protests, flooding the discourse with contradictory narratives, claiming protesters were fascist and foreign-backed terrorists. The more extreme the claims, the more engagement, and engagement in turn fueled broader algorithmic distribution. A few years later, those same tactics metastasized into the 2016 US last election, with fake social media pages targeting and impersonating groups such as African Americans, pro-Trump rallies organized by bots, and hyper-segmented ads targeting swing state voters with emotional appeals designed to suppress turnout. The goal wasn't persuasion through reason, but division through outrage. In turn, 2020's COVID pandemic wasn't just a public health crisis. It was a grand, unmoderated experiment in collective gullibility, broadcast live on every social media feed. The infodemic, a term coined in 2003 that came back into prominence in 2020, was a tidal wave of sewage pumped directly into the global town square, drenching everyone in unverified cures involving everything from bleach to colloidal silver. Suddenly, the internet landscape included not just homegrown hoaxes, but entire networks of seemingly legitimate news sites, Kremlin-backed proxy domains churning out tailored falsehoods and crudely doctored images and video clips, designed not to inform, but to thoroughly disorient and sow chaos far beyond their borders. It turned out that sowing enough sheer, unadulterated nonsense created the perfect conditions for people to embrace everything from pharmaceutical snake oil to the idea that the virus was a hoax invented by, well, depending on the day, take your pick. Fast forward to 2025, influence operations have evolved into a sprawling, globalized enterprise. AI-powered bots craft and publish content at scale, bullying both humans and rudimentary detection systems. Dark web cartels sell influence as a service, bundling custom deepfakes, targeted troll armies, and viral marketing stunts for clients ranging from autocrats to disgruntled frat brothers. The technologies have become cheaper, faster, and more accessible, lowering the barrier for anyone with an internet connection to wage psychological warfare online. In the shadow of these developments, public discourse has fractured beyond recognition. Every community, every demographic slice, and every pet enthusiast subreddit has its own tailored drip of fear, anger, or apathy. The history of online influence is a chilling chronicle of how genuine activism and utopian promise devolved into a systemic manipulation and commercial exploitation, and there is no sign of a course correction. Part 5. The Arsenal of Deception. Let's peel back the curtain on the toolbox these digital puppeteers wield. Think of it as your friendly tour through a house of horrors engineered for maximum psychological damage, each tactic honed for emotional impact and algorithmic virality. We have graduated from grainy Photoshop jobs to AI algorithms that can swap faces in video and transform anyone's voice into a perfect replica. Imagine a clip of your senator confessing to war crimes, or a video of a tech CEO admitting his products are backdoors for surveillance. They're so convincing that even trained professionals struggle to spot the fakery, and each new deepfake model is cheaper, faster, and more realistic than the last. Compared to the simple retweeting machines of days past, modern bots can monitor trending topics, analyze sentiment, and inject comments with contextually relevant yet inflammatory content. They move in synchronized swarms, boosting chosen hashtags, spamming comment sections, and gaming trending algorithms to make it look like organic outrage. And because each bot can operate hundreds of accounts simultaneously, they create the illusion of widespread consensus where none exists. So, if bots are automatic weapons, sock puppets are sniper rifles. Human-run accounts that slip into conversations with plausible backstories, genuine-sounding language, and a knack for persuasion. Troll farms employ thousands of these operatives, each juggling multiple personas, posting in dozens of forums, and weaving threads of disinformation that snake through social feeds. They'll escalate from friendly engagement to personal attacks in a heartbeat, keeping the victim off balance and consumed by the ordeal. In addition to that, astroturfing is the practice of manufacturing grassroots movements out of thin air, hiring cohorts of accounts to comment, like, and share until a real user believes they're witnessing a spontaneous uprising. People with fringe beliefs think that thousands of others share their views, except those thousands are bots, paid commenters, or part-time internet mercenaries. Astroturfing masks the true source of influence, allowing corporate or political clients to dodge responsibility while claiming a mandate from the people. Finally, the piece de resistance, the platforms themselves. Everything about modern social networks, from trending topic algorithms to For You feeds, is designed to maximize engagement, and nothing drives engagement, like sensationalism. These systems automatically reward posts that trigger outrage, fear, or moral panic, even if they're toxic or patently false. Bad actors simply feed the algorithm what it craves: incendiary headlines, angry rants, and divisive memes. The algorithm says more of this, and the influence campaign reach multiplies. Put it all together, and you have a self-perpetuating engine of manipulation. Bots and sock puppets seed the disinformation. Memes and deepfakes amplify it. Algorithms reward it, and real users, duped by their own emotions, spread it further. Every time someone shares a sensational post without verifying it, they don't become a victim. They become an accomplice, feeding fresh ammunition into the arsenal of deception. These tactics have grown more sophisticated, but the goal remains the same: hijack your attention, corrode your trust, and shape your reality into whatever suits the puppet masters pulling the strings. And until we build defenses capable of matching their speed and ingenuity, we remain sitting ducks in the digital crosshairs. Part 6. Echoes across borders. This global phenomenon has played out in every time zone and every political system, always with the same ruthless efficiency. Identify the fault line, amplify it until it cracks wide open, then watch the world squabble over the long shards. Take the 2016 US presidential election, where they created content promoting one side of a cultural or political rift, then ran parallel campaigns advocating for the opposite stance. They organized Facebook events for real-world rallies that never existed, engineered millions of ad impressions, targeted at swing state demographics, amplified the famous buttery males, and flooded Twitter with contradictory narratives until no one could tell the real from the fake. Their goal was not simply to elect one person over another, though they certainly had a preference. It was to turn an election into a two-sided street brawl, where the only winner was confusion itself. Across the pond, in the United Kingdom, the saga was no less spectacular. In the run-up to the 2016 Brexit referendum, bot armies on Twitter and Facebook plastered feeds with apocalyptic warnings about immigration, sovereignty, and a return to the glory days of empire, scaremongering memes about non-existent EU army deployments, and lawsuits against British homeowners went viral, all while genuine concerns about trade and regulation were drowned in a chorus of outrage. Some of the same disinformation architects who honed their craft in Eastern Europe quietly sold their services to UK campaigns, turning complex policy discussions into Instagram-friendly slogans, and turning voters' reasonable anxieties into a tidal wave of xenophobia. When the referendum passed by a razor-thin margin, the question wasn't only should we leave, but how many of those votes came from a distortion machine? The result was a country cleaved in half, still grappling with the fallout nearly a decade later. In South Africa, the 2024 elections became a textbook case of rage bait export gone wrong. Foreign actors and local mercenary influencers collaborated to exploit every social fault line, from race and economic inequality to water rights, then fed the smoldering embers back into global news cycles. Fabricated videos claimed that a township protest had led to mass looting of affluent suburbs. Audio deepfakes suggested opposition leaders were plotting violent coups, and meme accounts portrayed complex land reform debates as existential threats to civilization. The outcome wasn't just political upheaval, it was an eruption of communal distrust that drove wedges between neighbors and weakened fragile coalitions dedicated to social justice. NGOs and journalists who tried to push back found themselves outpaced by automated disinformation networks that could generate and distribute propaganda at lightning speed. Even high-stakes war zones aren't immune. In Ukraine, long before the tanks rolled across the border, there was an information blitzkrieg of doctored satellite images proving NATO troop buildups, fake eyewitness videos dramatizing phantom Ukraine atrocities, and bot-driven hashtag storms turning once neutral reporting into partisan warfare. Every time Western news outlets debunked a claim, new videos or posts emerged seconds later, because the architecture of the disinformation apparatus was built to operate at network speed, while fact-checkers still relied on email chains and manual verification. The relentless pressure campaign sapped international resolve and turned public public opinion polls into who can shout louder contests, giving Moscow enough cover to launch a full-scale invasion, while global attention was stuck in a whirlpool of alternative realities. From Brazil's rainforest debates to India's communal tensions, from the Philippines' election maneuvering to Canada's pipeline protests, the playbook gets reprinted, remixed, and relabeled for every cultural context. The same mercenaries, the same hollow rhetoric, the same hollowed-out pages posing as independent journalism, just retargeted to exploit whatever fault line will pay the highest price in clicks and ad revenue. The result is that no democracy, no matter how robust, is safe, and no movement for social justice, no matter how noble, can rely on pure earnestness when its opponents have entire industries devoted to manufacturing doubts about its legitimacy. Part 7. The Price of Influence. By now it should be obvious that these influence operations are a systemic assault on the very notion of democracy and social cohesion. The first casualty is always trust. When every tweet might be a Trojan horse, when every news clip could be a deepfake, people stop believing in institutions, the press, the courts, the Electoral Commission, even the health authorities. Trust isn't just a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's democracy's structural steel. Once that rusts, the building begins to collapse. Citizens start assuming bad faith on all sides, retreating into echo chambers where their biases are soothed and their suspicions confirmed, until the idea of a neutral, shared set of facts becomes as quaint as dial-up internet. From that foundation of distrust, polarization blooms like a toxic algae. Influence campaigns intentionally manufacture extremism at the margins, pumping radical content to swing voters who were previously indifferent, amplifying fear narratives to make compromise feel like surrender, and then letting social media's engagement algorithms do the rest. Every new flashpoint, be it immigration, economic policy, or public health, is weaponized to alienate half of the population from the other. Before you know it, political opponents look less like fellow citizens and more like existential threats. Prisons become more appealing than policy debates, because locking up the opposition feels safer than building middle ground with them. The price of this manufactured division is not just a rift in public discourse, but a breakdown in our ability to govern ourselves peacefully. Elections, the supposed cornerstone of democratic renewal, become the grand stage for this disinformation theater. When half the electorate believes the vote is rigged, voter suppression tactics designed by the same operatives who hijack social feeds suddenly look like reasonable precautions. Deepfake videos of candidates saying horrific things, hyper-targeted smear ads that never appear in public ad registries, and misinformation campaigns about polling station closures can all reduce turnout, taint results, and cast a long shadow of illegitimacy. Even a straightforward landslide victory can be portrayed as stolen triumph if enough influential voices keep claiming fraud. And because these voices can be bots, sock puppets, or anonymous pages, there is little accountability. The ballot box no longer decides outcomes. The information ecosystem does. While elites bicker over legality and policy, the real collateral damage hits ordinary people the hardest. Mental health deteriorates under constant alarm. Anxiety skyrockets when your feed is a carnival of existential crises. Burnout follows when anger becomes your default emotion, and cynicism seeps in when you suspect that any story, good or bad, has a hidden agenda. Communities fracture as neighbors accuse each other of being paid shills or out-of-touch elites. Social trust evaporates, leaving a cold, grinding mechanism where collaboration once flourished. The mental and emotional toll is not an externality, it is a core objective of these campaigns. A demoralized populace is easier to manipulate, more likely to disengage, and less capable of mounting collective demands for truth. The global consequences reverberate far beyond broken democracies. When adversarial states see the dividends paid by digital subversion, they double down on real-world aggression, secure in the knowledge that international outrage can be muted or redirected. Authoritarian regimes point to Western chaos as proof that democracy doesn't work, justifying their own crackdowns on dissent. Meanwhile, corporate interests exploit the confusion to sidestep regulations and push through extractive projects under the guise of national security or public order. The very idea of a rules-based international order built on agreed norms of transparency, accountability, and cooperation teeters on the brink of collapse. In the final tally, the price price of unchecked influence operations is nothing less than the erosion of the social contract. If citizens no longer trust each other, if elections no longer command legitimacy, if public discourse is reduced to a screaming match, then we might as well call it quits on pluralistic governance. The alternative is a technocratic oligarchy. Or worse, a balkanized patchwork of enclaves where basic facts are negotiable and power is secured not at the ballot box, but at the botnet console, and that is the true cost we're paying, a price we might not be able to afford. Part 8. Shielding the digital public. We have surveyed the carnage, from fractured democracies, burned out activists, and families fighting over fake videos of their own relatives to the puppet masters hauling cables through the world's data centers, rigging our feeds like marionettes in a global puppet show. But now comes the part where we desperately try to take the remote control from their sticky fingers, because if we don't, the future looks a lot less like the West Wing and more like a quiz show hosted by angry AI deepfakes. First, and I know you have been hearing this a lot recently, but we need to learn some damn media literacy. This isn't about learning dry textbook definitions of propaganda. It is a survival curriculum. We need to teach everyone from grade school how to spot emotional bait, trace a meme back to its origin, and read beyond the headline. Classrooms should be laboratories for real-time debunking exercises, with students dissecting live social media posts like surgeons performing digital autopsies. Because the day you can glance at a viral quote and instinctively know that it's sourced from a troll farm, that's the day we win the first battle. Until then, every share button remains a landmine. But schooling alone won't cut it. We need fact-checking that is built into our digital DNA. Social platforms cling to their engagement stats like a life raft. But if they truly value civic health over ad revenue, they will integrate transparent, rapid response fact-checking as a default feature, and those external sources they link must be independent, interdisciplinary, and ironclad in their impartiality. Otherwise, it's just more spin in different packaging. Regulation must catch up to the chaos. We cannot rely on CEOs playing whack-a-mole with disinformation because they have already proven that profit incentives will always trump public good. Governments have to step in with unambiguous rules. Every political ad must bear a digital watermark. Every micro-targeted message must be logged in a public repository. And any network of accounts found coordinating inauthentic behavior should be nuked from cyberspace. I don't care if regulation is a four-letter word in startup circles. When your startup is destabilizing elections, it's time to read a few legal briefs, because there is nothing libertarian about a reality where the only truth is the one your algorithm feeds you. The very technologies that fuel this inferno can help extinguish it. AI and machine learning are not just weapons in the wrong hands. They can be shields in the right ones. We need coordinated R&D into systems that sniff out botnets by their behavior patterns, flag deepfakes by detecting impossible facial micro-expressions, and map disinformation networks by analyzing rapid-fire posting spikes. These defense systems should be open source and distributed globally, so no single corrupt actor can buy exclusive access. It is a pitched arms race, but when the bad guys already have the first move, we have no choice but to field the defense, and the platforms must bear responsibility. For years, they have bashed their chests about connecting the world, all while quietly optimizing for outrage. Algorithms that reward sensationalism with prime placement are the real secret sauce in the influence industrial complex. It is time for radical transparency. Users should be able to see exactly why each post is recommended, which signals triggered its promotion, and who paid to boost it. No more black box magic. If a platform cannot open its recipe book and let regulatory chefs inspect the ingredients, then its engagement is just gilded manipulation. Finally, none of these measures will succeed in isolation. We need a global coalition of governments, civil society, academic institutions, tech firms, and everyday internet users. Think of it as an alliance against digital dystopia, a new version of NATO, but with fact checkers instead of tanks. Cross-border task forces will share intelligence on emerging disinformation tactics. Universities will analyze psychological impacts in real time. NGOs will run mass media literacy drives in vulnerable communities, and journalists will hold every actor accountable with relentless investigative pressure. Every node in the ecosystem must see itself as a sentinel. sentinel, because if one link fails, the chain of trust snaps. This sounds like a lot, and it is. But remember, the alternative is surrender. Surrender to a future where every debate is rigged by unseen hands, every vote shadowed by doubt, every neighbor suspicious of each other's motives. So yeah, let's rant about tyrannical regulation or preach about big tech, but let's also build the tools, the laws, the curricula, and the coalitions that will push back, because the same networked world that amplifies our darkest impulses can also amplify our shared determination to defend reality itself. That's it for this deep dive into the digital trenches. If you've made it this far without tossing your phone into the nearest river, congratulations. You are already more resilient than most. But remember, outrage is easy. Resilience takes work. That's all for Brain Rot News. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe before we die of whatever the fuck this is.